Well, hello there. Thank you for joining me today. Got a lot to uncover. We're going to be going through this mafia business today. People are really, people are starting to notice that things are shifting to be a little bit more authoritarian, right? They're making statements like, hey, we stood up to a king once in America. We can do it again. Well, I suggest you get your history straight first because, yeah, maybe people stood up to the king, maybe, but America lost the war, so I don't know. Maybe they stood up to the king part is correct, but the United States lost the war, so and the reason we probably have the movie Gone with the Wind to reenact what they want to claim was the fake Civil War, right? The most biggest movie of all time, Gone with the Wind. Keep implanting in your brain. Yes, it was a fight between the North and the South. Yes, only a fight between the North and the South. Now, it was different than that. But movies have really played a role because we've got some gypsies running things. But before I get started, I'd like to make a statement here. I have been undergoing smart meter radiation, and one thing that I've noticed is that just like I did a show recently about smoking, about how they lied about smoking. It's really interesting because just recently I ran across some town of people that they were all in my age group, and people in the town were all getting like Parkinson's from the chemical residue in that particular area. And guess who wasn't getting it? Well, the smokers. So all the people in this town were starting to have early Parkinson's, and they were, fighting against all that, obviously. And the people that weren't impacted were the people who had been smoking. So anyhow, so I've been thinking about this radiation thing because I am exhibiting symptoms of what might be considered Alzheimer's. So it got me thinking, we are surrounded by a pollution of plutonium, right? Plutonium, their god Pluto. Anyway, so yeah, their idea is to, it wasn't about war, it was about they needed to act like they were going to war to figure out how to make all this plutonium, right? So the impact, they knew back then that people were going to start getting lung cancer and stuff from the plutonium. So they cooked up the thing about smokers are going to get lung cancer. Well, I now have lung cancer from being in a plutonium soaked house. Um, so anyway, so yeah, so they had to cook up this idea about going to war, and all that time they're testing, 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 because in this end chapter of things, their entire goal is to destroy our DNA. And turns out plutonium is the best way to do it. But I'm not going to get into a lot about plutonium today. I'm just going to do it here in the intro because the subject of the mafia is a fascinating one. So, just real briefly, let me tell you this. So, here's what I'm thinking. I have my little nightly thinking sessions where I just sit around with the cats and we think and just kind of stare at the ceiling and stuff. And I have the computer turned off. And the other night I was thinking about this Alzheimer thing, and I thought, all these people are getting Alzheimer now, and a lot of it could be from the drugs like statins, which they have everybody on. That increases Alzheimer's and also increases diabetes, type 2 diabetes, from those statin pills that they have everybody on. But another factor that everybody's talking about is all of this Alzheimer's in the elderly population. Well, I think, and I think this 100% highly possible, people with dementia or Alzheimer's or however they word this stuff are actually suffering from radiation poisoning because I am having symptoms of what I would guess would be what dementia would be like, right? But I'm seeing it differently than most because I know what's going on. So I've also been self-monitoring myself very carefully. So I've been putting myself into more of an observer mode. Like I started, if I go to chop some vegetables, my hands work funny. It's really weird. All of a sudden my hands work funny. So I'm coming up with some neurological disconnects there. And also what I would be described as dementia signals in my brain. And I'm really sure that it's not much worse because I didn't stop and I kept working and kept using my brain. So I think fighting it off has really helped me. But here's what I want to tell you today, and then I want to get to the subject because I did look it up this morning because I wanted to know do I have this right? I'm sure that I have this right. I'm sure that people now getting dementia, they may be getting them from the pills, but they may be getting them from environmental pollutants like plutonium. So I asked a few questions. Here's the answer I got. A person exposed to plutonium long term might look like they have early dementia due to confusion, memory trouble, and personality changes, but they probably have other physical symptoms too, like weight loss, pain, or respiratory issues that don't match Alzheimer's. Well, right here, they have it partially right and partially wrong because, respiratory issues. Yeah, you can hear me. When I first started off recording these shows years ago, I had the microphone literally across the room on a desk, and I was sitting across from it. Okay, the microphone was nowhere in the picture. You didn't see the microphone anywhere, right? Because it was that far away. Now, in order to communicate, the microphone, unfortunately, is about an inch from my face. So that's why you hear it every little move that I make, you hear it now. But that is because I have been continuing to adjust as things move along, right? Like, so anyway, so I'll notice things and then I'll just pay closer attention. So anyway, so weight loss. Yes, most times when people get older, they will have some weight loss. So I think that this would very much get overlooked by in the medical community because I had an issue. I've never had weight issues except for twice in my life. And when I had a weight issue, I went in to see the doctor because I had gained like, oh, I don't know, like 40 pounds. I went from 130 to about 160 or so. And so anyway, so this was when I thought doctors knew what they're talking about. So I talked to the doctor. Well, first of all, the doctor was fat, the nurse was fat, and here I am complaining about only gaining 20, 30 pounds, right? And because then I still wasn't like fat, right? I wasn't like rolling in there like on a, you didn't need a gurney to roll me into the room. So anyway, so they really didn't really have much to say to me about why I gained this weight. They took very little interest, and it was written up, yeah, when you get older, everybody gains weight, right? So then, and this was when my immune system was breaking down, and I was trying to figure out what was going on because the pills they'd given me had broken down my immune system, but I didn't know all that then, right? So then, shortly after I gained all this weight, then all of a sudden I lost like 40 pounds and I was down to like, oh, I'm 5'9". I was down to about probably 110 or 120 pounds, right? So, and that's pretty thin for 5'9". So when I went in to say, hey, now all of a sudden I've lost all this weight, they're like, hey, good for you, good for you. How'd you do it? So I think talking to a medical doctor about weight loss or weight gain is kind of a worthless thing. But respiratory issues, yeah, I initially started having some respiratory issues. I wasn't sure about it. But then over time, it hasn't felt like it was really a respiratory issue. And I don't really notice it until I go to turn on the microphone and start talking. So yes, but the main respiratory issue I'm having is I become very exhausted from talking for too long. So that's why I have to limit how long I'll talk. But anyway, so yeah, so you know, they say the physical symptoms like weight loss, pain, and respiratory issues. Yes, you could have Alzheimer's and also have some of those things, right? I mean, two things can in fact function at the same time. So this really has me thinking, how many people out there are now getting treated for Alzheimer and stuff because everybody sees that they're losing track of things and you're not quite remembering certain things. And like, for example, you start to do kind of crazy things, right? Like my refrigerator stopped working for a while. Well, I really wasn't aware of it. So anyway, so yeah, you're not tracking on the same road as everybody else at that point. So anyway, so yeah, I'm pretty sure that this is what's going on because they want to destroy us. And what better way than when they're destroying your mind and you no longer can function, right? So then I also queried, and then I'll get moving here about how radiation affects the brain cells. Plutonium's alpha radiation doesn't travel far, but when it gets inside the body, inhaled, ingested, or through a wound, It's a cell-destroying nightmare. Here's what happens, especially in the brain. Alpha particles tear through nearby cells, breaking DNA strands and proteins. This triggers cell death or causes cells to mutate, which can lead to cancer if the cells survive but become abnormal. In the brain, this could lead to neuron death, causing memory loss or cognitive decline. There's this thing called glial cell damage. These are brain's support cells, helping with immune defense and repair. The blood-brain barrier damage. This thin protective layer keeps toxins out of the brain. Radiation can weaken it, allowing more harmful substances to sweep in. Oxidative stress. Okay, let me see here. Oh, wait a second. Okay. I zipped in the wrong direction. Okay. Radiation creates free radicals. You definitely don't want those free radicals. Unstable molecules that rip apart cell and DNA. The brain is especially vulnerable because it's packed with fatty acids, which oxidize early and need lots of oxygen to function. That's why I'm saying get those windows open. And this is exactly why they wanted us to be on a low-fat diet, because our brain needs that fat. Continuing on, over time, this can lead to chronic inflammation and neurodegeneration, which looks a lot like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease. So, yeah, radiation triggers the body's immune system, flooding the area with inflammatory cells to clean up the damage. In the brain, this is called glycosis, a form of brain scarring where glial cells overgrow. Scarring disrupts brain signals, leading to confusion, personality change, and memory issues, which again can mimic dementia. But the good news is this, is that, I have been repairing my body by using whole single item foods. And I've been talking about that endlessly. Go listen to those shows about sugar that I've been doing. And I have another show about sugar that is going to knock the top of your head off, but not for today. There's something new about this sugar thing, but I'll get back to that. Because the brain does repair itself. The brain is surprisingly resilient, but repair depends on how much damage is done. Here's how it fights back. The brain can grow new neurons, mostly in the hippocampus, but radiation damage slows this process down, and chronic inflammation makes it even harder. Plasticity, rewiring the brain. The brain can reroute signals around damaged areas, like a detour around a blocked road. This works better in younger brains, but even adult brains can reorganize to recover lost functions. Brain cells do have a built-in DNA repair system, but it's slow. If too much damage happens all at once, like from a sudden blast of radiation, the cell self-destructs instead of fixing itself. But what we're talking about is not sudden exposure to radiation, it's the long term that we're getting inside of these horrible homes that we're sitting in, right? Before you turn off and say, what is she talking about? My home is perfectly safe. Go listen to my other shows. Your home is the danger point in all this. That is exactly why they want you out looking at the sky. Oh, look at the chemtrails. Look up there. Look up there. All of that activity keeps your focus away from where the real monster is hiding, and that is in the home. And just real briefly, they claim they have therapies, antioxidant therapies to neutralize free radicals. I believe, and they have a drug called Tempo. I believe eat whole foods and sleep at night, and this starts to resolve itself. I should have been dead years ago. When they hooked up the transformer to my smart meter, had I not known what's going on, the first time I had that huge, almost seizure-like, almost went into a grand mal seizure, that should have taken me out. So I'm guessing that they figure that once they hook up the transformer to the smart meter, with the smart meter going on, the plutonium's coming into your home, but the transformer just puts it on steroids. So I think that they likely estimate that when they do these actions, just a smart meter is just going to kind of grind you down over time, right? You're not going to really notice that you're starting to wear down, you get a little less energy and all that. But when they hook up that transformer to the smart meter, it really accelerates the plutonium coming into the home. Because the first year, I was just going by instincts when I put in fans all through my house. I just instinctually knew that I had to get fresh air in here. I only have been discovering why I was doing what I was doing, but I was only working on instincts. So yeah, it happens over time. So you don't really notice it when it's creeping up on you. But anyway, so what I'm going to be doing is I will cover this much more in much more detail later because the end result that they're looking for is to destroy our DNA. No better way to do that than with plutonium. And I'll put a link below. I have a brand new page about the end result of plutonium. Look at those poor babies in Iraq. That is what the goal is. They want everybody producing sad, deformed, hardly able to live children. That's the goal. But let's keep moving along for today. So, I'll be talking about the mafia, how it got started in the USA. And there's a mafia out of Ukraine. And then this will help to make this robbery of tax dollars make more sense. Because right now they're talking about they're using the 18th century war times law, and the question is called the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, which gives the president broad authority to detain and deport non-citizens during times of war. Trump invoked the law earlier this month to justify deporting alleged members of this trained Venezuelan gang. They said members of the gang had unlawfully infiltrated the U.S. and are conducting irregular warfare against Americans, Trump explained. ICE officials can conduct a warrantless arrest if they believe an individual is likely to escape, but they must provide evidence. Well, maybe they provide evidence, maybe they don't. What's missing in all of this is they're rounding up these people and saying, oh, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. They rounded up this guy. He's a famous soccer player or something like that. Shouldn't have got him. Too bad. He's gone. He's over in San Salvador somewhere. Well, they're not, they want you to think that they're geniuses out hunting down these people. This is not a complicated plan. The people they're hauling off first are basically people who they already had in the system. They're in the system because they're people that thought they were going through the system by applying for green cards or whatever, right? So they came to this country, they applied for these visas and stuff, right? So they're sitting in their homes one day and all of a sudden they get rounded up. Well, because they can find them easier. That's the whole trick here, right? Because they know where these people are. So if the country is truly infiltrated by Venezuelan gangs, well, it would probably take a lot of work for them to figure this out, right? So easier to go around and round up people who are going through the system and put in their names, and so they know their names and their addresses. Frankly, if I was one of those families, I would make damn sure that I was not at any residence where they thought I was going to be, and that's all I'm going to say on that matter. But yeah, so why am I talking about that? Well, this is how I got started on this whole mafia thing because I've been doing all this work about those Pritzker people and all of the stuff going on with them. And I discovered that one of the Pritzker relatives certainly looked like a gypsy. Well, the Pritzkers come from the Ukraine area. Prior to it being Ukraine, it was called Kazakhstan, and there was a mafia there. So all of this mafia stuff starts to roll in together. So how I got here specifically was I was wandering around and looking at more Pritzker business and Pritzker crimes, and I discovered that when they invoked the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, it's only been invoked a few times, and the one time it was invoked was when they rounded up all of the Japanese people that were in this country. They were rounded up and sent to camps, right? We all remember that, right? Oh, dreadful part of the U.S. history, just horrible, could never happen again. Well, yeah, it is going to happen again because we only learned part of the reason why those particular people were rounded up, the Japanese people, because the Japanese people had a lot of assets. So I read that this criminal group out of Chicago, a mafia criminal group out of Chicago, called the Organization, they were the ones who, along with FDR, who gave approval for this, they were the ones who pulled off the operation. So they were the ones who literally fleeced all of those Japanese people out of their money. So that's why they locked them up. So while they were locked up, they could grab their money. So long story short, so I started wandering back around about all this mafia business. And I encourage you to always look for yourself because I discovered how all those orphan train children, I never gave up on those kids. It took me years to finally figure out where they went. And I finally figured it out just because one day I was wandering around and I read about white slave women being sold at auction during Ottoman Empire in Turkey. So I started thinking, whoa, wait a minute, because that's when I was looking into when they were bringing in white people. So I started thinking, well, why were they selling white women in Turkey? Well, that's how I discovered that whole thing with the Crusaders, that whole thing in Russia where they were being forced out of Russia. That's where all those kids came from. But it takes persistence. It keeps continuing to go around and keep looking and looking, right? So yeah, so uh, never stop looking. So whenever you find something that you're interested in looking at, let's say you're interested in looking at the Mafia. The first thing I do is I open up two files. One file is just labeled Mafia, and the other is labeled Mafia Show Notes. So as I'm buzzing along, what I'm doing is I'm over on Yandex, of course. What I'm doing is I'm just changing my keywords around. If you know keywords, you unlock the whole internet. So I'm over there tooling around with my keywords and I started getting hits on things, right? And that's where I started looking into more about these Pritzkers and this Japanese money deal. Well, so then as you're buzzing along, you start putting details into your Mafia file. And then where'd you get that information from? Plunk that link in the other file. So you never work backwards. I rarely have to go back and look at an article twice because my first sweep through, I captured what I want out of that article. I put it in my file, and then my other file, I put a link to where I got it from because we need to always credit these things, and we also need to understand what trail it took. The reason I've been encouraging people to read through the notes that I provide for you is because it's impossible to understand all of this by hearing an hour or two podcast. Hopefully, the notes and stuff will encourage you to dig further because I'm going to be talking about the mafia in general, but we're not going to be solving any mafia crimes or anything. Like, did Gotti really kill this guy? We're not going to get at that level. But so I think what basically happened was this, um, and I watched about a million mafia movies, and I came up with one that really gives the history in a way that makes a lot of sense for us here. Because what happened is, I am saying that the people who took over a couple hundred years ago were, in fact, gypsies. And basically, they came over first. I started trailing these people, and because they came out of the UK, they were calling themselves, we called them pilgrims, right? So in the UK, they had these people, and they were unhappy with they called the religion of the king in time during the UK. So these pilgrims, but at the time they were called Brownist or separatists. These people were unhappy with the King of England. So they wanted to leave to strike out on their own for this religious freedom. And I think what's missing in all this, which is never said, is what is this religious freedom? I think the religious freedom was the freedom to practice Satanism. So, anyway, so these people who we assumed were like the pilgrims, they pack up out of the UK, and where do they go next? Well, they go to Amsterdam, and there they settle in a place called Leiden, Leiden, in Amsterdam. and they continued to carry on their lives for a few years there in Amsterdam. And then some of them hopped on the Mayflower and came over here. Well, I have been tracking the ones who didn't hop on the Mayflower because that was my aha moment when I read that. Thought, well, wait a minute. What about the people that didn't hop on the Mayflower? And that is precisely why right now Amsterdam is in fact the hub for all the cocaine, all the sex trafficking, all the pornography, because the people that were left behind in Amsterdam and didn't join the other gypsies here in the United States, they're the ones running all the criminal organizations there now. And they also traveled to familiar areas. When they were in the UK, they were in an area called Norfolk, okay? Norfolk, right? So they went from Norfolk, UK to Amsterdam. Then some of them went on the Mayflower and came here, right? 100 or so of them, because I've been tracking this original 300 people. Well, some of them stayed behind, some of them came. So, what patterns can we find about this? Well, I think what happened was the ones that came early on the Mayflower, they were the early ones here setting things up. But there were people here before that because around the Gilded Ages, these people took over what was going on. They took over those homes that were built that were there before they got here, those big fancy houses. And keep in mind, those big fancy houses were built without electricity. The people before the ones that got here that stole those fancy houses, they were the ones who installed the electricity because it's my belief the early people who actually built those homes, because all those Tartaria people, they're always saying, well, yeah, how'd they do it? How'd they build those homes using horses and buggies? Well, because they didn't build those homes. That's why. So anyhow, so they didn't build the homes. They got rid of the people who were clearly black or some Muslims that were here before, the Moors that actually built all of the Moorish things that this whole country is nothing but Moor symbolism. So they got rid of those people. But anyways, the connection with Norfolk is interesting because they left there, Norfolk, Virginia, Norfolk, UK is where this whole deal with the Pilgrims all got started, right? Well, what do we have here in the United States? We have Norfolk, Virginia. What's in Norfolk, Virginia? Well, Norfolk, Virginia is where the CIA and all those thugs hang out. Good morning, Norfolk, Virginia. Yeah, Norfolk, Virginia, very key area, right? There's something about all of this is coded and predestined. Well, as it turns out, I ended up living in Norfolk, Nebraska. I don't know how I ended up here. It's been a long story, but I came from Silicon Valley in California where I was raised. I spent a few years in Sedona, and I ended up in Norfolk, Nebraska. And turns out I'm living in a coven. So, yeah, the same people that set all this up are the same people that are running things right now. And they're involved in all kinds of things like cocaine and trafficking of children and all that. Today, I'm going to be focusing on the cocaine trade. I've already been talking about how they're using the sex trafficking and all that out of the Amsterdam area. But today we're going to focus more on cocaine because I've talked in the past, in the 70s, cocaine was a huge deal in this country. And it all ties to the Iran, the Contras, and all of that mess going on, right? But today I'm going to clear up all of those things about it. There was a person involved in this called Gary Webb. Gary Webb was a journalist from that era. Gary Webb allegedly was killed for his involvement. Well, some think it's suicide, some think he was killed. I now think Gary may have actually killed himself. But anyways, I'll be getting to that because I was in California and cocaine was all over the party scene in the late 70s. And it was only about a 2-year period. I mean, I basically, I got into LSD for a couple of years in the 60s and then did cocaine in the late 70s. But I basically walked away because I found it so boring because of how these people behave when you get on cocaine. And that's exactly the same thing Adderall does to people. They get very delusional. And really, after a couple of years of snorting coke on the party scene and stuff in LA, I actually found it kind of boring. And the people you see today in charge of things and all this crazy thinking and stuff, that's exactly how people snorting cocaine used to still behave. So, yeah, so I have a lot about this Gary Webb business also, so we can take a look at all of that, how Gary was set up. Gary was set up and turned on by everybody in the world but a couple of people. So I believe they went from the heavy drugs to, oh, shoot. I just realized this isn't plugged in. Well, it should sound okay, hopefully. Oh, oh boy. So anyway, so yeah, Gary Webb, the whole world turned on that guy. The dude hardly had a chance. But so let's get going on what I know so far, because when I get into some of these complicated things, like I have today, I'll be talking about all the different places they're now running the cocaine through and stuff. I'll post some of that down below because it's too much to try to remember as I'm going along here for you to follow me. So basically, how the cocaine and the mafia and all that got started was this. This is just the short end of the story, right? Well, we had prohibition in this country. Prohibition is what set fire to the mafia. And interestingly enough, of course, nobody saw the mafia operating until, oh my God, it's too late. So yeah, so and then the prohibition didn't get ended until FDR. So they let the mafia run wild. I mean, absolutely wild for all of those years, right? Because oh, who saw anything, right? And they're doing the exact same thing in Amsterdam. As a matter of fact, remember, Galveston was the biggest financial center of this country. Well, Galveston got blown away in 1900 and still the largest event of this whole history. All that water and that tide and the water hit Galveston and wiped out the financial center. What they turned Galveston into? Well, a casino. So this is another date of reference here. That was another date that they took over because the people that were living here before, they built those houses and they also had places like Galveston already set up. Well, these people came along around the same area and wiped it all out. So then they turned Galveston. See, they want to turn anything that's good into something that is trash, right? That's why their motto became salvation through sin. In other words, not salvation by not practicing sin, but by salvation by actually committing sin. That is their operating path they're on. So, anyhow, so basically, this clip I'm going to be playing in a bit goes through all the different mob families, all of that. But basically, what happened was this: these people were already over here. They took over those homes. And then I believe they sent for their relatives. And their relatives were people out of Italy and places, thugs, people who could put law and order. And remember, the CIA always runs a dual operation. So it's my belief that this is where the mafia, they call it organized crime, okay? So we have the corporations and we have the organized crime, right? Talk about a dual operation, right? So what they said was this, was that it wasn't until the 30s and 1940s until lawmen like this guy named Thomas Dewey and J. Edgar Hoover, after years of denial, that the federal government began making serious moves against the mafia. And keep in mind, they did not make a serious move against the mafia until 1960, Robert Kennedy. So here's how it worked. The mafia operated in the shadows. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, Italian American crime groups, especially those with roots in Sicily, were relatively small and kept to ethnic neighborhoods. Their activities, extortion, smuggling, protection rackets, mostly targeted other immigrants, so they stayed under law enforcement radar at first. And they claim that there wasn't a powerful centralized federal force to tackle organized crime back then. Policing was mostly a local and state responsibility, and many cities lacked the resources or political will to take on these groups. Like I said, this has been a big game about omission, right? The FBI wasn't even founded until 1908 and didn't focus on organized crime for decades. See how that worked? Corruption and political protection. The mafia gained influence by bribing police, judges, and politicians, ensuring they were left alone. Many local officials turned a blind eye, especially in cities like New York, Chicago, and New Orleans, where early mafia groups like the Black Hand were active. Prohibition from 1920 to 1933 changed everything. Once alcohol became illegal, bootlegging became a massive moneymaker. So I believe this is all the reason, right? Because I keep saying it's the plan, not the bug in the system, right? So by allowing prohibition, that's why I'm always saying evil has to come packaged as help. Like they were so worried about people drinking too much that they wanted to have prohibition, right? Well, they really want people drinking, and here's why. They call alcohol spirits. Do you realize that when you drink alcohol, you are, in fact, releasing demons? Did you hear me correctly? When you consume alcohol, you are allowing for the invasion of demons. People don't need to understand why, but they need to understand that's what's happening, right? Ever been around somebody who drinks too much and they seem to kind of shift into some other personality after a couple of drinks and you recognize it's almost like some other entity? Well, because it is, in fact, another entity. That is why they push alcohol. So, probably by causing prohibition, it made people want it even more, right? So, yeah, they want to act like, oh, yeah, drinking is fine. Drinking is okay. Doctors will tell you, yeah, drinking when you're pregnant, sure, why not have a glass or two of wine? Well, because alcohol is not only a neurotoxin, the worst part is this: it invokes spirits into your environment. You need to consider blocking your energy. I have my energy very well blocked. I am living in Norfolk, Nebraska. It is officially a coven. All these people in this town know that I'm here. So I have my energy very well blocked because I will have no chance of healing myself if I'm getting pinged by all these outside energy. But yes, I can peek around the wall and see what's coming. They're trying to send my way. What they do when they come up with these covens is they meet in these different centers all over this United States. There's people meeting in churches, in Mason lodges, and what they're doing is all the stuff I was talking about with Elon Musk taking him to that place in North Carolina for that ritual. They're doing these rituals on a daily basis in this country all the way through the world, but they're not doing them for us in fancy mansions or castles. They're doing them in Masonic lodges and churches all around this country. So, yes, there are a lot of people chanting a lot of bad energy around. So, do yourself a favor and block your energy. Don't let them get to you. So, anyway, so let's get back to this stuff. So, what's going on now? Well, in Amsterdam, it sounds just like the same as it happened here. They have the Mocro, Mocro, Mafia. Is a prominent criminal organization that controls a significant portion of the cocaine trade. The term Mocro refers to individuals of Moroccan descent, and the group comprises predominantly of Dutch Moroccan criminals. Their operations extend beyond the Netherlands, influencing drug trafficking networks across Europe. The Mocro Mafia gained notoriety following a violent gang war that erupted after a substantial cocaine theft in 2012. This conflict led to numerous assassinations and violent incidents across several countries, including Belgium, Spain, and Morocco. The Dutch government, now listen up, the Dutch government and European law enforcement agencies were slow to take decisive action against the Mocro Mafia. Boy, isn't that a shock, right? I hope you can regain from your shock enough to listen to the rest of this. I know the first time I read that statement to myself, I had to flutter a little napkin in front of my face and go, "Oh, don't! This is so shocking to hear that they didn't know it. This is so shocking." So initially, authorities viewed the Mocro Mafia as just another criminal group involved in local drug trafficking. Yeah, so just another group of thugs killing people. However, the 2012 Antwerp cocaine heist, in which a shipment worth $40 million was stolen, escalated conflicts between rival factions, leading to a wave of assassinations across Europe. By the time authorities recognized the group's power, it had already established deep roots. Gee, where does this sound familiar? Ha! Almost like the mafia here in the United States. Gee, rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat again. Hidden operations and money laundering. Unlike traditional mafia groups that relied on visible extortion and racketeering, the Mocro Mafia primarily operated through encrypted communication, Sky, ECC, EncroChat, money laundering, and corrupting officials. Huh, sound even more familiar. Remember, I've been saying for years, when the mafia in the United States, with the John Gotti trial, when they stopped focusing on taking down the mafia here, what happened next? Silicon Valley. They moved into Silicon Valley. Maybe people didn't hear me when I've been saying this for the last 30 years. Maybe you'll hear me now that Silicon Valley is standing right next to the Dawn there in the White House. Yes, I've been saying for years, when the mafia closed up shop in New York with the Gotti trial, well, what popped into place next? Silicon Valley. And I happened to be working in Silicon Valley. I was relocated there around 1978 to 1979, and I was there until 1999. I always felt it felt a bit mafia. Yes, in fact, it is. Silicon Valley did not invent anything. They stole everything they had. But let me not get off track here. So let me get back on the track here. So yeah, thanks to Silicon Valley, they were able to encrypt all their macro mafia stuff, right? So they said this made it difficult for authorities to track their activities. Oh, sure it did. They also used legitimate businesses in construction. Oh, that sounds just like the mob. Real estate, huh? Sounds just like Donald Trump. Huh? Hospitality to launder money, further obscuring their crimes. Well, your crimes are only as obscure as when somebody doesn't bother to look for them, right? And then also political and law enforcement apathy. This is a shocking part. For years, the Dutch government took a permissive stance toward drug related crimes, particularly because the Netherlands is a major hub for drug distribution in Europe. The focus was more on harm reduction, i.e., tolerance toward cannabis, than cracking down on organized crime. This allowed the Mocro Mafia to flourish, making Amsterdam and Rotterdam key entry points for cocaine shipments from South America. Corruption and infiltration. Reports indicate that the Mocro Mafia infiltrated ports, Rotterdam, Antwerp, customs, and even law enforcement, using bribes and intimidation to facilitate smuggling. Corruption within these systems allowed them to operate relatively undisturbed for years. Yeah, these big ports in Rotterdam and Antwerp. It's crazy. One of these big ports, I don't know, as of a couple of years ago, you could just literally walk around that port where they're rigging all the drugs and stuff. There was no security, nothing to stop you. So, and here's the timeline of what caught their attention. I've been saying for years, they always close up shop or announce it when it's too hot to keep going, right? They closed up Epstein when it was too hot in the kitchen. They closed up Pornhub when it was too hot in the kitchen. They close them up. They bring in the investigation. What does that do? Well, it seals up all the records, right? Because then their friends at the FBI and stuff grab all the records. So that way nobody ever gets punished. So authorities only took serious action after high profile murders, including in 2016, the beheading of Nabal B, this brother guy who was a witness. 2019, the assassination of lawyer Derek Weirsa, who represented a witness against this other group. 2021, the murder of investigative journalist Peter de Vries, known for exposing the Mocro Mafia. These killings forced the Dutch. Now, see, pay attention to this language because obviously, before they started visibly just murdering people in the streets, everything was okay, right? But these killings forced the Dutch government to increase police resources, enhance witness protection programs, and target top leaders. So, and they arrested one guy in 2019 in Dubai. Boy, that was a really quite a haul, wasn't it? In conclusion, the Dutch authorities ignored or underestimated the Mocro Mafia for years due to their hidden operations, deep-rooted corruption, and a lenient approach toward drug-related crimes. Only after extreme violence and international pressure did they begin taking significant action against the organization. So, there was this saying, I have this saying, yeah, it's kind of plunked in the middle here, but I found this piece while I was wandering. You'd be surprised if you just have, if you, I don't understand when people say that they're bored, and I don't understand people that just watch social media posts all day long and don't go out and look for themselves. I truly do not understand it. Because here's what I ran across when I was just nosing around over some things about the mafia. You know, all these fires we have. Well, somebody's actually trying to do something about it. I just love odd details. So, over the past few years, raging wildfires in Italy have become a common and deadly occurrence. In southern Italy, intense record breaking heat waves and dry winds create the perfect conditions for wildfires, both natural and coordinated. Remember, I've been talking about those Santana winds in California, also known as the Satan winds. They're creating these winds. So anyway, in the paper, it's called Land on Fire. It says the spatial production of the mafia, and it's published in a special issue of this new thing called The New Geographies of Organized Crime. And this brilliant student, Lauren Pearson, I really like this person. They're really stepping out there with something interesting. What she does is she links this surge in wildfire outbreaks to the weaponization of the fire by the Sicilian mafia. So, in examining this idea, Pearson's study bridges a major gap between geography and criminology. Sicily experienced, and remember, they've always used fires. Like, for example, during the Franklin case, there was a lot of programming of children being done at the Presidio in San Francisco. Now, the parents didn't know what was going on. The kids were being dropped off at the daycare there, and they were being programmed and tortured. Well, same thing happened at the McMartin case, McMartin Daycare School. But what people don't understand was this was happening way before Presidio. It started happening as far back as West Point. But what do they do? Well, they had two fires at Presidio, and they organized the fires on certain satanic meeting dates that they torch this stuff. They always like to set things on fire. That's why it's important to pay attention to. This study is actually quite fascinating. At least to me, it is. So they go on to say that Sicily experienced over 8,000 wildfires. And I've been saying for years that when the United States, what they're going to be doing is they're going to take down the United States first, okay? And it's already starting. Countries are ganging up and saying, don't travel to the United States. If their citizens travel here, keep your eyes on them. So they're building it up so they can bring the UNs to the troops here because I believe the United States is going to go up in a big ring of fire. So that's why I'm talking to you about fire in case you're wondering, well, wait a minute, I thought we were going to talk about Mafia. Okay, so they went on to say, so 8,000 wildfires in 2021 just in Sicily. Over 70% of those wildfires were arsons tied to vendettas, land disputes, protests, and the weaponization of fire by the mafia, according to the study. And I have this study down below too. I couldn't get the study. This one study I found was in Italian, and I unfortunately never got around to getting it translated. But if you can speak Italian, I've got it down below. Or if you're smarter than me and you can translate it yourself, then go ahead. So the wildfires burned over 120,000 acres of vegetation and forced thousands of people to evacuate from their homes because land theft is also really big at play here, right? The impact of these attacks is far reaching, given that most wildfires occur in places with a strong mafia presence. Pearson's research aims to uncover the connection between organized crime and the wildfire crisis. My overall question is why is this happening? Asked Pearson. None of the answers have been satisfactory. That's the impetus for my research. Historically, the evolution of the mafia has coincided with capitalist developments such as globalization or economic crisis. This paper proposes that the phenomena of illegally set wildfires in Sicily reflects an emerging transformation in the mafia's organizational structure. The dynamic of the Sicilian mafia is changing within this particular moment of climate change, Pearson says. They're taking advantage of fire similar to how they might have weaponized post-war transitions or transitions to more urban environments. Pearson said this transformation is not an isolated event, but rather a continuation of recurring historical and geographical processes. In identifying and exploring the implication of this pattern, she seeks to reorientate our understanding of mafia crime. Political, economic, and societal issues are part of the dialect that keeps producing mafia space. Fire is a new iteration of how the mafia reproduces themselves and reproduces their landscapes anew. So, yeah, I'm gonna leave that alone, but this is what you find if you just go out looking and you find these other people out there doing these kind of, I don't know, I find that somebody is looking into fires and the mafia and arson to be very interesting because, yes, of course it has to do with the mafia, right? So, and also remember, they're the ones who created the climate change. But so let me get back to the mafia as far as in present time, or actually how they got started. The because I've been wandering around the uh, Pritzker family, the Hyatt Hotel people and stuff. They are from the Ukraine area. Ukraine used to be Karzar. So, in winding back a little bit about his story, the Bolsheviks were actually created and deployed by the Kharkarian Mafia, or the KM, as the essential part of their long-planned revenge on the Russian Tsar and the innocent Russian people for breaking up the Khazaria in about 1000 AD for its repeated robbery. So Khazaria evidently got broken up around 1000 AD, okay? Because of the murder and identity theft of travelers from countries surrounded Khazaria. This little-known fact explains the extreme violence taken out on Russia as long-standing revenge by the Rothschild-controlled Khazarian Mafia, the KM. The Bolsheviks, at the direction of the Rothschild KM, raped, tortured, and mass murdered approximately 100 million Russians, including women, children, and infants. Some of the torture and bloodletting was so extreme, it's not going to even be mentioned. But anyways, the Rothschild Khazarian Mafia, or KM, once again decided to sheep dip themselves and infiltrated and hijacked all of Judaism. I've been talking about these people really weren't Jews, they were just traveling as Jews, right? So let's just cover this part. The Rothschild KM created a master plan to control all of Judaism and mind control Judaites. The Rothschild KM has hijacked Judaism, patterned it off Babylonian Talmudism, Luciferianism, or Satanism, and gained control over the banking and Wall Street professions in general. Congress, the major mass media, along with most wealth and economic means of success. Thus, the Rothschild KM could pass out wealth and success to those Judaites who drank their Kool-Aid and used them as cutouts, assets, and samarins. In this manner, the Rothschilds hijacked Judaism. Their financing of the Israeli Kisnet and construction of it using Freemason occult architecture displayed their commitment to the occult and Babylonian Talmudism and all the evil accompanying it, including child sacrifice to their secret god Baal. They set up a NWO system called World Zionism, which taught an incalculable, susceptible Judaites with a paranoid group delusion of racial superiority, which assumed that all Gentiles were intent on mass murdering all Judaites. They called this radically paranoid mass Judaic delusion of world conquest World Zionism, which is really a form of covert Babylonian Talmudism or Luciferianism that have been unknown to mainstream Judaics. The system was designed to use Judaics as cover, but also to anoint them with Babylonian money power in order to use them as cutouts and to later be sacrificed to Lucifer in 2 stages. And this is all making a lot of sense, right? Because I said years ago, they latched on to the actual Jews, these Ashkenazi Jews latched on to the actual Jews because they were good at keeping the records and the books and stuff. So they basically they co-opted the name Ashkenazi Jew, which has a Nazi in it, right? So because the system was designed to use Judaics as cover, but to anoint them with Babylonian money power in order to use them as cutouts and to later be sacrificed to Lucifer in 2 stages. The first stage would be their planned World War II in Nazi work camps, cut off from supplies, resulting in the deaths of about 200,000 Judaics from starvation and disease, along with about 90,000 non-Judaic inmates from the same causes, according to respected Red Cross official figures. This number is 5% of what the Khazarian Mafia, also known as the World Zionist, claim. The second great sacrifice would be a final one, when their new world order Luciferian king would be placed into power and when all 3 Abrahamic religions would be irradiated, especially Judaism, which would be blamed for all the wars and destruction of the world. By then, the Rothschilds would once again morph themselves into a complete new identity, not associated with Judaism in any form, not even World Zionism. It is important to realize that the Rothschild KM took Germany down to nothing after World War I, created a vacuum for fascism, Foss. See, this is where the dementia part happens, right? It's just some word. Foss. I can't. F fascism, and to rebuild it, creating Nazism and installing Hitler as a counterforce to the Russian Bolshevik. So let me reread this. It is important to realize that the Rothschild KM took Germany down to nothing after World War I, created a vacuum for fascism, and then rebuilt it, created Nazism, and installing Hitler as a counterforce to the Russian Bolshevism. Once the Rothschild KM gained their own private homeland in Israel in 1947 through their covert political manipulations, they began to secretly view all of Palestine as their new Karkaria, Khazaria, and began plotting how to genocide all the Palestinians and steal all of Palestine for themselves. Their plans include their fantasy of constructing a greater Israel by taking over the whole Middle East and manipulating dumb American Goyim to fight and die on their behalf, taking all the Arab lands for Israel and the Khazarian Mafia, the KM, so they can asset strip their wealth and natural resources, especially their crude oil. So the Kingdom of Khazaria was a Turkish empire which had its epicenter in what is now known as Ukraine. I'm going to put this on hold. I need to take a bit of a break here. This show is going to be very long. I am planning on sticking with it until I am all the way done. So I get that you understand how to use the pause button. So I plan on continuing to get this Mafia thing all wrapped up today, unless something crazy happens, but I'll be back in a bit. Okay, before I get started here, one reminder. If you plan on starting a garden, which I would encourage you to, garden soil is not regulated in this country. Surprise, surprise. So if you want to buy garden soil, be careful because it could be that rotten soil they've hauled off from toxic sites. So your best bet would be to stick with something like organic earthworms. That way you can make sure you don't have any toxicity into it. So anyway, so let's keep going on this business here. I'm going to be covering a little bit more about this Khazarian business, and then we're going to be moving on. So they claim how it got started was this, is that the leaders of the surrounding nations, especially Russia, had so many years of complaints by their citizens that as a group they delivered an ultimatum to the Khazarian king. They sent a communique to the Khazarian king that he must choose one of the three Abrahamic religions for his people and make it his official state religion and require all Khazarian citizens to practice it and socialize all Khazarian children to practice that faith. The Khazarian king was given the choice between Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. The Khazarian king chose Judaism and promised to stay within the requirements laid out by the surrounding confederacy of nations led by the Russian Tsar. Despite his agreement and promise, the Khazarian king and his inner circle of oligarchs kept practicing ancient Babylonian black magic, also known as secret Satanism. This secret Satanism involved occult ceremonies featuring child sacrifice after bleeding them out, drinking their blood, and eating their hearts. The deep, dark secret of the occult ceremonies was that they were based on ancient Baal worship, also known as worship of the owl. In order to fool the confederacy of nations led by Russia that were watching Khazaria, the Khazarian king melted these Luciferian the Khazarian king melded these Luciferian black magic practices with Judaism and created a secret satanic hybrid religion known as Babylonian Talmudism. This was made the national religion of Khazar and nurtured the same evil that Khazaria was known for before. Sadly, the Khazarians continued their evil ways, robbing and murdering those from surrounding countries that traveled through Khazaria. Khazarian robbers often attempted to assume their identities after they murdered these visitors and became masters of disguise and false identities, a practice they have continued even to this very day, along with their child sacrificing occult ceremonies, which are actually ancient Baal worship. So that's a little bit of history as far as those people there. Uh, I'm going to be scanning down here because it could really get in the weeds here, but this gives us a background of considering that what they say is this. Let's see if I get back. I scroll down. So there is no Gentile or Judite, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbar. I don't know what that means. Okay, so also, here's an interesting thing, the Bolsheviks, right, around that 1900 time, the great majority of these vicious Bolsheviks were Ashkenazi Jews. So that means the Ashkenazi Jews are, in fact, the gypsies, right, or the pilgrims, or whatever name you want to give them, were Ashkenazi Jews such as Vladimir Lenin, Leon Trotsky. Yeah. So the famous Russians were also Ashkenazi Jews, which would be code for gypsies, right? They were financed by Ashkenazi bankers from New York and London, such as Rothschild Bank, Loeb and Company, who themselves championed the destructive ideology of the Ashkenazi Karl Marx and found it profitable to invest in communism's disastrous conquest of Russia while making a few bucks in the process by plundering the country via a well-placed agent who would later become known as oligarchs. After the destruction of Khazaria, the Ashkenazim scattered east and west throughout Europe and reinvented themselves as errant Jews or wandering Jews, meaning roaming Jews. That label had nothing to do with longing for Palestine, but a longing for Khazaria, or perhaps a longing for a new land, any new land. So, yeah, that's exactly who these people are, right? So, these oligarchs, right? And remember, 1906 was when they also made they took all the oil fields and made them national interest. And that's when the growth of Standard Oil started at the same time. There's always a cause and effect. The Bolshevik Revolution. I've been trying to understand this Bolsheviks forever, and finally we get a handle on it. The Jewish Bolsheviks who took over the Russian government in the 1910s killed 66 million Christians. So the Ashkenazi Jews hanging out as Bolsheviks in 1910, they killed 66 million Christians, including 200,000 members of the Christian clergy, and destroyed 40,000 churches. World War I, Britain was losing the war against Germany. The Zionists stepped in and bribed President Wilson to get the U.S. into the war to help them. In return, the Jews asked the British Empire to deed them Palestine to create Israel. Their wish was granted in the form of the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which cost the world 18 million dead people. World War II, the Zionists fomented that war, just like they're doing today with Iran and other countries in the Middle East, so that European Jews could feel threatened. The deception worked as European Jews fled in droves to Palestine and took over the homes of Palestinians who were evicted at gunpoint and then either massacred or driven out of their land into neighboring Arab countries. With enough Jews on the ground, Israel was created in 1948 at the cost of 80 million dead. The Khazarian Mafia and the Chicago Mafia. The territory now known as Ukraine was once the heart of the Khazar, or the Khazar kingdom. This kingdom was largely unknown to the general population until this person, Arthur Koestler, wrote about its history in his 1976 book, The 13th Tribe. And this is fascinating because remember, I've been tracking those same 300. They claim those Ashkenazi Jews. We keep tracking the same 300 people. There were 300 people that were written into one of the laws here in the United States, the 300 families that were omitted from something, from some crime they were committing. There were 300 people found to have the same DNA, and that was caused by incest, and that came out under these Ashkenazi Jews. Those DNA kits is what busted them and made it clear that those Ashkenazi Jews were not the Jews they were claiming they were being. So this is just really fascinating. It's called the 13th Tribe. In the 13th Tribe, Koestler advanced a theory that Ashkenazi Jews are descendants not from the Israelites of antiquity, but from the Khazars, a Turkish people in the Caucasus that converted to Judaism in the 8th century and was later forced westward. Koestler argued that a proof that Ashkenazi Jews have no biological connection to biblical Jews would remove the racial basis of European anti Semitism. So, the 13th tribe. Okay, although his view is called a theory, it is one that is supported by the Jewish Encyclopedia itself. And here's what this section said that I found. It says, Khazars, a people of Turkish origin whose life and history are interwoven with the very beginnings of the history of the Jews in Russia. The kingdom of the Khazars was firmly established in most of South Russia long before the foundation of the Russian monarchy by the Bulgarians in 855. It was probably about that time, 7th century, that the Chargan of the Khazars and his grandees, together with a large number of his heathen people, embraced the Jewish religion. And same thing as those gypsies. The gypsies and the Jews always traveling around together, right? The gypsies with no known really history. Huh, imagine that, right? Imagine that. Then also in the Jewish Encyclopedia, there's another quote written by this King James of the Khazars to this other person of the Jewish courts. It says, let me see here. Yeah, they're all related. In fact, modern Jews are a combination of Judah, Edom, and Khazar. Yeah. Russians eventually conquered the Khazars and incorporated their land into Russia. In 1917, the Khazars in turn overthrew Russia and established the Soviet Union. This was not a Russian revolution, but a Jewish revolution in Russia. This is why the Lower East Side of New York City, the Jewish section, sent the first 256 commissioners to rule Russia, including Rabbi Leon Bronstein, who took the name Leon Trotsky. After a 70-year captivity, the Soviet Union began to collapse and break apart. The Soviet republics became relatively independent, including the Ukraine. This brings us the present conflict where Russia is again overthrowing the Khazar stronghold. There's this person, Ben Fulford, has been quite vocal in his claim that the present deep state is controlled by the Khazarian Mafia. Fulford, being Jewish himself, distinguishes between traditional Judaism and the Khazar Zionist portion of world Jewry. If being a Jew is a matter of race or genealogy, then one could more easily distinguish the two groups. However, if being a Jew is a matter of religion, then it is a question of denomination within Judaism itself. Jews have long debated how to define a Jew, and I do not intend to get involved in that argument. The point is that the Ukraine in recent years has become the deep state center for laundering money, banking, child trafficking, and many other forms of corruption. It seems clear that the Khazars have been attempting to reestablish the original Khazar kingdom in the Ukraine. The recent attempt to take Kazakhstan, which failed, was actually an attempt to enlarge the deep state's territory to the Khazarian kingdom's original borders. Russia intervened and prevented this coup from succeeding. Now, I gotta tell you, all of this stuff makes perfect sense to me. I'll keep reading. The attempted coup in Khazarian should be viewed as a precursor to the present war in Ukraine. We must also know about the long historical conflict between Russia and Khazaria. Putin knows his history well. As a member of the Russian Orthodox Church, Putin also has another motive. Kiev, Kiev, is the birthplace of the Russian Orthodox Church and the conversion of the Grand Prince of Kiev in 988. Hence, Kiev has great religious significance to Putin, who considers himself protector of the faith. In 2014, the U.S. State Department successfully orchestrated the Maidan Revolt in Kiev and essentially captured the country for its own use. Hunter Biden was given a position on the board of Burisma, a gas company, so that he could receive 83,000 a month in an elaborate payoff scheme. Nancy Pelosi's son and Mitt Romney's son were also given paid positions. This was when the real corruption started. So the Rothschilds then covertly ran the British Empire. Wait a minute, that's another part of the news here. Let me see here. Yeah, we've already done this Rothschild opium thing. But this is new that I didn't cover. The Rothschilds, through their international spy network, had heard of Turkish opium and its habit-forming characteristic. Yeah, I did that whole show about opium, and I didn't catch this first part here. So they deployed a covert operation to buy Turkish opium and sell it into China, infecting millions with a bad opium habit that brought back gold and silver into the Rothschild coffers, but not to the British people. The opium addictions created by Rothschild opium sales to China harmed China so much that China went to war on two separate occasions. Yeah, I've already covered all this. Another thing, those Sassoons that I talked about that were in charge of all this opium stuff that came out of Turkey up into India and through the UK, probably where that Nazi peace sign came from when they spent time in India there. The Sassoons actually, I don't remember if I mentioned this, but after I did that show, I found another piece about the Sassoons, and the Sassoons actually originated from Germany. Just hold that thought. All these people seem to be originating from Germany, and it has a lot to do with the geographics and stuff. So let me get back to the Rothschilds here. The Rothschilds also follow the same business template in the Caribbean and the Asian subcontinent of India, resulting in the murder of millions of people. Excuse me. Um, the Rothschilds start the international slave trade, an enterprise that viewed these kidnapping humans as mere animals, a view that the Khazarians would impose on all the people of the world who were not part of their equal circle, which some called the old black nobility. So these Khazarians are also being called the old black nobility. The Rothschilds' next big project was to start the worldwide slave trade. So, and then they got into all the banking and stuff. So I'm going to move past some of this Khazarian stuff. And this is where it gets interesting, though. When they did the central banking, The Rothschild KM attempts to retake America in 1812 on behalf of the Khazarian Mafia, but fails once again because of Russian interference. This failure enraged the Rothschild KM, and they once again plot eternal revenge against both the Russians and the American colonists, and plan to infiltrate and hijack both nations and asset strip, tyrannize, and then mass murder both nations and their populace. The KM's attempts to set up a private American central bank are blocked by President Andrew Jackson, who called them satanic and vowed to rout them out by the grace of power of the Almighty God. The Rothschild banksters regrouped and continued their covert attempts to install their own Babylonian money inside of America. Finally, in 1913, the Rothschild KM succeeds in establishing a major beachhead inside America. So, yeah, they passed the illegal, unconstitutional Federal Reserve Act on Christmas Eve without a required quorum. The act was then signed by a crooked, bought-off president who was a traitor to America, like the members of Congress who voted for it. And that was exactly about the time of the big takeover, right? And then, of course, they set up the Federal Bureau of Investigation to protect their banksters. Um, so the Rothschild KM deployed the Bolshevik Revolution to invade in Russia to extract incredible savage, bloody revenge on innocent Russians, which they had plotted for many years, ever since Khazarian was destroyed. I don't know about you, but this is all making a tremendous amount of sense to me about what is going on. But I'm not going to be able to keep going on this whole thing. I'm going to put this on hold again right now. I think what I'm going to be doing is we're just trying to get the layout of the land here in this mafia business, right? Well, I think we kind of get the idea that some pretty serious things happen over in Ukraine in that area, right? And that answers a big question. Why are they sending all this tax-funded money to there? But I could literally go on into all this Khazarian stuff, but the articles are all down below. I really hope you will take a look. So, yeah, this is why this mafia thing makes a lot of sense to me. This is part of the plot, right? I'm gonna put this on hold. I'm going to be playing this clip now because this clip will give us an overview of the mafia organization. And one thing you'll notice is missing in this whole thing is they're not talking about any children being raped, right? I think in this story about the mafia, what they're leaving out is the child trafficking part, because I believe that's being run out of, well, it's a whole different deal, but so how they present the mafia is this. Well, they have the leg up in this deal, right? Because the mafia was who really set up Hollywood stuff. So they're really telling us by movies and stuff what they want us to think about them. And people tend to think very favorably towards the mafia. There are millions, and I'm talking about millions of shows about the mafia. There's big money in these mafia shows. And all of these shows have also crafted the image of the mafia with things like, yeah, they may be kind of bad. They go out and they do these horrible things to rob money and stuff. But you know what? When they go home at night, they're really good parents. I mean, mafia dads make good dads. And I don't believe that for a second, okay? They want us to think that a psychopath who runs around calling out what people should be murdered that day or where big huge shipments of cocaine should go that are going to ruin completely populations. They really want us to believe that that same guy goes home and is just a wonderful dad to his family. I don't think that any of that is true. But that is part of the image because if you read the comments in these mafia shows and stuff, and there's a lot of them, and I'll list my three favorite channels down below. But if you start to look at these mafia shows, first of all, if you run across a channel that isn't showing you the correct historical pictures, don't even bother with them, okay? That is a lazy production. It takes a tremendous amount of work to do a documentary and line up the right pictures and stuff. because people just want to keep their eyes busy. A lot of people do shows, and the pictures don't even relate to what they're talking about, which makes no sense to me, but I digress. So, yeah, look for somebody who's using the correct pictures along with what they're talking about, right? Can't remember what I was saying there. So yeah, so they have crafted their own image for themselves, right? So if you read the comments, people say things, oh, those men were really men back then. They really took care of their families and they went out and made a hard living. Yeah, well, they were thugs, okay? They were psychopaths and they were thugs. So, but the overall impression that we have was conjured up by movies and stuff, right? So the movies and stuff are what happened. So basically, it's this. There are there were five crime families in New York. And remember, five is their number, right? I did a spot check on most of the major crime bosses. They all came from Italy. They all came around the 1800s, early 1900s. They landed here, okay? So I see it as the mafia people were already here running things. They were the ones who burned all the records and put on the fake civil war and stole everything. And they called in their relative backups from out of Italy who came in. And also notice that a lot of these early mafia bosses were all very, very short people because they were gypsies, tiny little men, like Lucky Luciano. These are very small men, okay? Because if you look at Italians, gypsies, and Jews, they all look the same, right? They all have olive colored skin. They all predominantly have black hair. They all have dark eyes. They had a lot of trouble during World War II because they were rounding up a lot of Italians because they all also have that Roman nose. So gypsies, Italians, and Jews have a lot of similarities. So anyhow, so what you want to pay attention to is in all of these mafia shows and stuff, not much talking about the child rape business. Hardly a word about it. It's like these guys are guys who are just wonderful people. They go to church with the family on Sundays, and they're just wonderful. Make the greatest dads on earth. Well, I have to say that that is part of the image they want us to present. So anyway, so down below I have several things. I found some good articles. Donald Trump is controlled by the Mossad, the Ukraine, and the Khazaria. I found several articles on that. I am fascinated by all of this Khazaria business. We're not going to solve this Khazaria thing today, but it makes a great deal of sense to me. Is this who is really running things? Did these Khazarian mafias, are they the ones who came over and did all this? And they were the ones who took off from the UK? I don't know. Today we're just exploring, right? So I keep forgetting to mention this. Sunglasses. Do not wear sunglasses. I have an article for you to take a look at. Your eyes need the sun. Anyway, so also, the U.S. is now weakening rules for allowing discharge in our water, raw sewage in our water. Happy times are here again. So anyway, so yeah, I will also be playing a few more clips here. I have a clip from Gary Webb in his own words about what was going on during the Gary Webb thing and the cracking, the crack and cocaine epidemic, which started in this country in the 70s. Keep in mind, all of this has been confirmed. None of this is speculation. I also found a good interview by a guy named Freeway Rick Ross. He was the one who really let the crack cocaine thing set on fire in the black community. Like I said, us white kids were over there doing cocaine. The black kids across the way were doing crack. And most white kids never ended up in jail. So anyway, and then I also have some good articles about the Dark Alliance, the CIA, the Contras, and the cocaine explosion in the United States. I found a couple of books about these things. So also about the Mafia and the Freemasons. The Mafia was actually started by the Freemasons, and I'll have more about that in a bit here. So I'm going to be putting this on hold. We're going to be playing that Mafia clip. It'll give us a history of the Mafia. And then I need to take a rest, and then I'll come back and continue on from there.
the man known to history as Charles Lucky Luciano was born Salvatore Lucania on the 24th of November 1897 in the village of Leccara Fridi, near the city of Palermo in the northwest of the island of Sicily. Salvatore's father was Antonio, a miner who worked in the local sulfur pits near Palermo. He and Salvatore always had a contentious relationship, one which got worse over the years. His mother was Rosalie. At home in Italy, he also had two siblings, a sister named Francesca and a brother by the name of Giuseppe. Another brother by the name of Bartolo was later born in New York. His name gradually changed from Salvatore Lucania over time. In his teenage years, he adopted the name Charles, as people in America had begun referring to him as Sal or Sally, as an abbreviation of Salvatore, and he didn't like the sound of this. Lucania became Luciano during the 1930s, as the New York newspapers consistently garbled his surname and spelled it wrong, while it has been assumed that he became nicknamed Lucky in an ironic sense after he luckily survived a gang war attack in October 1929, during which he was beaten so badly he could barely see out of his eyes, and had his throat slashed before being left unconscious in a forest on Staten Island. Others applied the name Lucky to him thereafter, though in person he nearly always went by Charles or Charlie. Luciano had a droopy eye from the attack for the rest of his life. Many of the details of Lucky Luciano's incredible life story are debated today. There are significant reasons for this. Firstly, he was a crime boss, one who necessarily attempted to keep his actions and the details of his life secret for much of his own lifetime in order to avoid police prosecution. But the waters were muddied further by the publication in the mid-1970s, over a decade after Luciano died, of The Last Testament of Lucky Luciano, a memoir of his life which he allegedly dictated to the film producer Martin Gosch in the months prior to his death, in anticipation of making a film version of his story. It was subsequently edited and published after Gosch died in 1973 as a book by Richard Hammer, a freelance writer who Gosch had employed before his death to write up what Luciano had allegedly told him. However, there was immediately a debate even before it was published as to whether the details provided in the book were genuinely related to Gosch by Luciano, or to what extent the memoirs were a work of invention, with the New York Times at the point of publication noting that The Last Testament reproduced errors found in other books which had been written up to that point on the Cosa Nostra, the Sicilian Mafia, a seeming indication that Gosch or Hammer had simply taken much of their information from other secondary literature, rather than The Last Testament being the genuine reflections of Luciano on his life, looking back from the vantage point of the early 1960s. Nevertheless, while it can be difficult to separate fact from fiction when it comes to such a legendary character, the general facts of his life have been well established nearly a century after many of the most important details of it occurred. In just over half a century following the completion of the unification of Italy in the early 1860s, some 15 or so million people left Italy in search of a better life in the Americas, with the overwhelming majority settling in either Argentina or the United States, with Buenos Aires and New York City being the key entry points. The Lucanias were just one such family, setting sail from Sicily bound for the New World in the spring of 1907. This was around the absolute peak of the Italian migration, and there was also a massive influx of Irish, Jews, and other groups at this time. 20,000 migrants arrived in just one day to the Lower East Side of New York City, breaking all previous records set up to that point. This was the chaotic environment which greeted the Lucanias as they themselves arrived to the Lower East Side. People heaved everywhere. Poverty was rife. Jobs were available, paid little, garbage lined the streets, the smell was foul, the disease outbreaks were common, compounded around the time the Lucanias arrived to New York by a strike by city street cleaners, a huge number of which were Italians. People lived with 4 families on each floor in the sprawling tenements, with 1 toilet for all 4 apartments, and with constant noise from the street, plus sweltering heat in the summers, which led some to sleep in the fire escapes at night. This was how America was built. It was not a good environment, and many Italians, Irish, Jews, and others turned to crime in a very short period of time after arriving to better themselves. Luciano was amongst those who were enticed into New York's less legal activities before long. In the late 1900s, there were numerous gangs of children and teenagers operating around the Lower East Side and Manhattan more broadly, picking the pockets of their victims, robbing street vendors, and even getting into low-level gambling operations, often venturing further afield to relieve the wealthier denizens of the great metropolis of their money and belongings while riding the ferries from Manhattan to Staten Island and Queens. Luciano was soon amongst these child hoodlums and before long had formed his own gang, running an operation whereby they extorted protection money from other children in return for keeping them safe on their way to and from school. One day, Luciano and his band of teenage extortionists approached a Jewish kid, and Charles explained that he would have to pay them 5 cents a week for protection. The boy told him in not a very polite fashion that he wouldn't be paying him the money. It was the beginning of a lifelong friendship between Luciano and Maya Lansky, who was over 4 years younger than Luciano and his associates, and whose gumption in standing up to his would-be harassers impressed Lucky. Luciano's father was a traditional Italian working man who continued the humble existence he had lived back in Sicily in New York. He tried to discipline and control Lucky for his criminal activity and his constant non-attendance at school, eventually being sent to a secure school in Brooklyn, where he was forced to attend classes for a few months in 1911. Thereafter, he left entirely at 14 years of age and got a citizen's job working as a clerk at the Goodman Hat Company on Green Street, running north from Lower Manhattan towards the Bowery and Greenwich Village. He would stay working there for 4 years and must have been good at it, as his pay rose steadily. At the same time, though, he was working his way up in the criminal world, running a gang of young criminals on the east side of Manhattan. Clearly, this group was not engaged in minor activities. In June 1916, when he was still just 18 years old, he was arrested in a bar, and Luciano ended up serving his first jail sentence for a term of 8 months at New Hampton Farms Reformatory. When he got out, he briefly returned to his job at Goodman's, but it didn't stick. Luciano's philosophy by then being, quote, "If I have to be a crumb, I'd rather be dead." A crumb to Luciano being the average working man. Thereafter, he became ever more embedded in the New York crime world. He got to know many of the 20th century's most famous criminals during these years. Figures like Al Capone, who were also rising up in the New York underworld at this time, though Capone soon absconded to Chicago after a violent bar fight in Manhattan in 1919 landed him in trouble with the police. Luciano's closest associates after a time were his old friend Maya Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, the latter being another Jewish teenage hoodlum who got his name for being crazy as a bug and his overt willingness to use a gun when needed. On the Italian front, Luciano befriended 2 other important figures at this time: Francesco Castiglia, better known to history as Frank Costello, an Italian from Calabria, the boot of Italy near Sicily on the Italian mainland, and Vito Genovese, another Italian originally from near the city of Naples. Luciano, Lansky, and the others worked together on and off through the late 1910s and early 1920s, but they were small-time criminals at this juncture for the most part. What would change things was their growing association with some of the foremost Italian gangsters in New York. Men like Joe the Boss Masseria, who Luciano was close enough to by the late summer of 1922 that when Masseria was targeted by a hitman by the name of Umberto Valenti during a turf war in a failed murder attempt, Luciano was amongst those who later went after Valenti. It was apparently Lucky who remained calm during the engagement and killed him. What allowed Luciano and others like Genovese, Costello and Lansky to go from peripheral figures in New York's underworld to become some of the most dominant criminals on the East Coast of the United States was the prohibition on the sale and supply of alcohol, which was introduced across America through the 18th Amendment in 1920. Prohibition was introduced in many ways as a way for the political establishment in America, which were people of generally British heritage and Protestants, to attack Roman Catholics arriving from Ireland, Italy, and other parts of Europe, and setting up restaurants and bars across the 1900s and 1910s. It had the opposite effect. Firstly, it did not work, and secondly, it became a catalyst for the expansion and professionalization of the Italian, Irish, and Jewish mafias, in particular in cities like New York, Chicago, Boston, and many others. Luciano was one of the great beneficiaries, as he, Lansky, and others began producing, moving, and selling ever greater quantities of bootleg alcohol around the tri-state area during the 1920s. They grew to become some of the foremost figures in Masseria's criminal organization. Without prohibition, it is possible that very few people would know a century later who Salvatore Lucania even was. Luciano and Lansky did not rise entirely owing to their links with Joe Masseria. They had another connection. Arnold Rothstein, often nicknamed the Brain, was a somewhat different kind of early 20th century New York criminal. He was born into an affluent Jewish-American family in Manhattan back in 1882. In the course of the 1910s, he rose on the back of his application of mathematical principles to illegal gambling and a keen business sense, running casinos and horse racing tracks up and down much of the East Coast. He was infamously alleged to have fixed the 1919 World Series of Baseball in order to make $350,000, yet this has never been fully proven. By the mid-1920s, Luciano and Lansky were being mentored by Rothstein, who lent a more businessman-like approach to their burgeoning operations. He also cultivated the idea in them that appearances were important. Did Luciano want to be viewed as a small-time gun for hire or a leading crime boss? Rothstein asked him. Luciano and Lansky both decided on the latter, and as the years went by, they evolved from criminals on the make on the Lower East Side to well-dressed operators living in the suburbs of New York or discreetly in Manhattan hotels under aliases and directing affairs rather than getting their hands dirty moving bootleg alcohol themselves. It was an ethos which would be adopted throughout much of the Italian-American mafia in years to come. It was not all risk-free, far from it. Before they came fully under Rothstein's wing, Luciano was still selling and handling narcotics, even as alcohol was becoming the bread and butter of people like him in the 1920s. In the summer of 1923, he is recorded as regularly meeting a distributor by the name of John Lyons in a pool room on East 14th Street in Manhattan. That is until the day that he realized that Lyons was an undercover cop. After being taken to a police station, they informed him about what he already knew. With his previous conviction from back in 1916, he was looking at a 10-year sentence. To save himself, Luciano gave them some information about a storehouse where they could find a huge quantity of drugs. They checked out the address and confirmed that the information he had given them was accurate. Luciano walked, and he did so without informing on anybody. The storehouse was where he was stashing his own drugs. It was a narrow escape, though one which also gives an insight into how much money he was already making by then. The stash had an estimated street value of $150,000. By then, he was able to survive a loss like that, and within a year, he and Lansky were renting out a suite in the upmarket Claridge Hotel, from where they were directing a brigade of bootleggers who were operating up and down the East Coast, often bringing in narcotics from Canada as well, where the port of Montreal was a major entry point for the North American market in the interwar period. while in due time, Luciano also benefited from Rothstein's connections to people who were importing opium along the main route available for importation in the 1920s from China and the port of Hong Kong. In 1928, Luciano and Lansky had become major players in New York's crime world, operating their own business along with being senior associates of Rothstein and Joe Masseria. A reorientation occurred later that year. In September, Rothstein, who was a notorious gambler, took part in a gambling session in New York, which involved dice, stud poker, and even high card draw. By the time it ended, he had lost $340,000, a sum equivalent to about $6 million today. This was a sum of money Rothstein could have quite easily paid off. Nevertheless, he refused to do so afterwards, claiming that the poker game had been fixed to con him out of a large sum. His refusal to pay up proved very costly indeed, and on the 4th of November, he was shot in the groin near Park Central Hotel. He died in hospital 2 days later, having refused to reveal to police who had shot him. With his death, his empire was divided up between a number of gangsters. Luciano decided to move closer to Joe Masseria in the aftermath of the collapse of Rothstein's empire. It was the beginning of a brief yet significant alliance between them. More broadly, Rothstein's death would have a bearing on events throughout the 1930s. When he died, many of his records were leaked, a great percentage of which included details of bribes he had paid to police and state prosecutors in New York over a period of nearly 20 years. In response, in 1929 and into the early 1930s, a generation of corrupt state officials were ousted across New York and replaced by more zealous newcomers. Chief amongst them was a special state prosecutor by the name of Thomas E. Dewey, who would play a major role in Luciano's life in years to come. Dewey's involvement in Luciano's story lay a few years ahead. What was of more immediate consequence in the aftermath of Rothstein's death was the rivalry which was developing between Masseria and a rival boss by the name of Salvatore Maranzano. Maranzano was a Sicilian who had arrived to New York in 1925. Well-dressed, educated, ruthless, and a strangely paradoxical figure. One who was a crime boss yet also spoke Latin and had once considered entering the priesthood. By the late 1920s, he was a growing problem for Masseria, and the attack on Luciano, which left him scarred and nearly dead in 1929, was possibly carried out by some of Maranzano's allies. Masseria responded to his rival's growing power by ordering Luciano, Genovese, and others to murder Gaetano Reina, a former member of the Masseria gang, after he joined Maranzano's crew. With Reina's murder in February 1930, the Castellamarese War broke out between Masseria's crime family and that of Maranzano. The conflict was named for the port town in Sicily where Maranzano and many of his crew members came from. It raged for over a year. Eventually, seeing that Maranzano had gotten the upper hand, Luciano, along with Costello and Genovese, decided to switch sides and agreed to kill their boss. On the 15th of April 1931, in an episode which inspired the famous murder scene from the first Godfather book and film, Luciano met Masseria at the Nuova Villa Tamaro restaurant on Coney Island, where he, Masseria, and others had some food and then played cards. At a certain time, Luciano went to the bathroom, the signal for Genovese and others to enter the premises and gun down Masseria. With the Castellamarese War at an end, Luciano and the others went to work for Maranzano. In the weeks that followed, Maranzano decided to come up with a new dispensation, whereby the different outfits and crews of Italian Americans operating in New York and the wider tri-state area would function, resurrecting an idea which had been proposed by Johnny Torrio, a Chicago boss who had been dominant there in the early 1920s before the rise of Al Capone. He decided that the 5 most prominent outfits would divide power between them, each of them having their own parts of the city, state, and New Jersey, in which they would be in charge of bootlegging, prostitution, gambling, and other criminal activity. They would be called the Five Families and were headed by five of the most powerful bosses of the time: Maranzano himself, Luciano, Giuseppe Profaci, Thomas Galliano, and Vincent Mangano. Each would have the ability to operate independently of each other in their respective zones of influence. But Maranzano decided at the same time to proclaim himself as the capo di tutti capi, the boss of bosses. Through this, each of the other families would pay tribute to him. This concept of a boss of bosses would play a central role in Luciano's story over the next several years, and would be resurrected at various times over the decades that followed. The arrangement did not last long. Within a few months, there was evident tension between Maranzano and Luciano, much of it based on Maranzano's heavy-handedness and also his clear prejudice against their Jewish colleagues, like Lansky and Siegel. By the autumn of 1931, Maranzano was already discussing the idea of removing Luciano and others close to him, who had been working with Masseria in the 1920s, including Genovese and Costello. Luciano's suspicions about Maranzano's intentions were aroused when the boss of bosses asked him on several occasions what his home address was, to which Luciano dismissively replied that he didn't have a fixed home. Lucky also began planning to murder Maranzano, a plan he accelerated when he got a call in September 1931 asking for him and Genovese to meet him at his new office suite near Grand Central Station on Park Avenue. Instead, Luciano contacted Lansky, who had arranged for 4 hitmen who Maranzano would not recognize to go to his office disguised as Internal Revenue Service officers. It was known that Maranzano was having tax difficulties and was expecting IRS officials to call to his office, so the bodyguards were let in. There, Maranzano was stabbed 6 times. As he fought back, the assassins, who had tried to do things quietly, pulled out their weapons and shot him 4 times. To make sure he was dead, they then slit his throat. Luciano was now in a position of unprecedented power following the rapid disappearance from New York's criminal underworld of Rothstein, Masseria, and Maranzano. He could at this juncture have made a claim to be the boss of bosses, much like Maranzano had tried to set himself up as, particularly so as another major figure, Al Capone, was also about to be removed from the scene out in Chicago, as the authorities there were coming to the end of a case which would see him sentenced to over a decade in prison on charges of tax evasion. Nevertheless, Luciano chose not to claim a position of preponderance. After years of bloodshed, he contended that collegiality and a fair division of territory in which everyone would benefit was the best way of proceeding. Accordingly, within weeks of Maranzano's death, the commission was established, whereby 7 individuals, the heads of the 5 families in New York, plus the head of the Chicago outfit, and a 7th figure from the region in between Cleveland, Ohio and Buffalo, New York, which in 1931 was Frank or Ciccio Milano, would each meet occasionally to direct the affairs of the Italian-American Mafia, which would be run as a decentralized syndicate, with each family administering its own territory and staying out of the affairs of others, except where their interests overlapped. It was the beginning of the Mafia as a national crime organization, and Luciano, more than any other individual, brought it about. The next several years were ones of flux for Luciano and his crime family. Genovese became his second-in-command, with Costello as his consigliere. They continued to work closely with Lansky and Siegel and the wider Jewish mob, as well as the other 4 New York families. A transition was undertaken in 1933 when Prohibition came to an end, and the massive loss of revenue was compensated for by an expansion of their activities into many other fields, notably gambling, with Siegel heading out west to try to establish a gambling haven in Galveston, Texas, later relocating to Las Vegas, Nevada. Other initiatives included a growing role in the unions and labor movement, as well as the expansion of the narcotics trade. Luciano became a very wealthy man in the process. He was difficult to pin down, residing at various luxury hotels around Manhattan, notably the Waldorf Astoria, arguably the most esteemed hotel in the whole world at the time, later relocating to the Bazelon Plaza. Despite the plush surroundings, he maintained some of his old habits. One evening at the Bazelon, he ordered silverware and dishes up to his room without any food. An associate of Luciano's had brought him over some spaghetti cooked by his mother. He didn't marry, and at least in the 1920s and 1930s, rarely had any committed relationships other than that with his sometime girlfriend, gay all over, instead dating a string of women for short periods of time, a habit which apparently resulted in a venereal disease, which troubled him periodically throughout his life. The mid-1930s were a period of instability for reasons beyond the end of Prohibition. It was during this period that Thomas Dewey, the New York special investigator who in years to come would become the Republican candidate in both the 1944 and 1948 presidential elections, intensified his efforts to crack down on organized crime in New York. Having acquired a strong supporter when Fiorello LaGuardia, himself the son of Italian immigrants, was elected as mayor of New York in 1934. Dewey set his sights first on Dutch Schultz, a German Jewish mobster who was an associate of Luciano and Lansky. He had diversified out of bootlegging in the early 1930s by becoming a major player in the numbers game or lottery in Harlem. Dewey followed the money and was soon tightening the noose on Schultz, with tax evasion charges. As he did so, Schultz made it known that he was considering trying to kill Dewey. When it became clear what he intended, Luciano and others had no option except to act. Luciano made it clear that murdering a special prosecutor who was close to the mayor and an emerging Republican Party politician would bring unprecedented attention to bear on the Mafia's activities and would lead to a major investigation. Consequently, on the 24th of October 1935, Dutch Schultz was murdered in Newark, New Jersey. The problem presented by Dewey did not go away once Schultz was removed from the scene. Instead, it only got worse for Lucky. On the 1st of February 1936, just over 3 months after Schultz's murder, Dewey oversaw the simultaneous launching of police raids on a huge number of brothels all over Manhattan and Brooklyn. Over 100 prostitutes were arrested, along with madams and brothel managers. Questioning followed. Many didn't have much information to provide other than what was readily apparent to anyone who had raided the establishments. But Dewey and his colleagues managed to pull together enough information to just about come up with a case to charge Luciano with pandering, a crime which involves profiting from the vices or weaknesses of others, one which was usually used against pimps and brothel runners. As the investigation team did its work, operating out of the Woolworth building in Tribeca, which until 1930 had held the crown of the world's tallest building, Luciano was down in Miami, Florida, where he often spent the colder winter months overseeing the mob's growing business in Florida and offshore in Havana, Cuba. He received word there from Lansky about the brothel raids and decided to make himself scarce, heading out to Hot Springs in Arkansas, where the mob had several casinos and numerous biddable politicians on the payroll. He waited there to see how events in New York would unfold. In the weeks that followed, Luciano's whereabouts in Arkansas were discovered, and he was eventually picked up and put on a train under armed escort in mid-April 1936. Returned to New York, he was greeted by a crowd of journalists at Penn Station and was put in front of a judge a few hours later. There Dewey began his attack, stating that Luciano was the head of a wide-ranging, yet still improperly understood criminal enterprise with nationwide concerns. He believed Luciano was a very wealthy man and requested a bail of $350,000. The judge agreed. The arraignment had set a precedent, whereby Dewey would attempt to turn what was a fairly flimsy vice and pandering charge into a much wider case concerning Luciano's criminal affairs in general, despite a resounding lack of evidence on matters pertaining to the narcotics trade, gambling, and other areas of activity. The trial began just over 3 weeks later and lasted 1 month. Dewey followed his initial pattern at the arraignment of making it about much more than the vice and pandering offences, and instead built up a case concerning Luciano's wider role as a leading New York criminal boss. It culminated in Luciano taking the stand. During cross-examination, Dewey got the better of him, with Lucky slipping at one juncture during a lengthy session in which he lied about virtually everything else, but admitted to being a minor bootlegger for a time in the 1920s, as Dewey questioned how he had become so wealthy without having a legitimate job throughout the Prohibition era. This and other revelations led the jury to determine that Luciano's testimony could not be trusted. His lawyer had already told him before the verdict came down that he would be found guilty. 11 days later, the judge sentenced him to 30 to 50 years in prison. The sentence, when it came, was a major blow to Luciano. Although he had expected to be found guilty on some offences, it had never seemed feasible that he would be given what in reality amounted to nearly a life sentence. There were serious questions asked at the time about how the case was prosecuted and the nature of the evidence, with Meyer Lansky proclaiming that his buddy Charlie had been set up. He was perhaps not entirely incorrect. While there is little doubt that the Mafia was involved in prostitution in New York, the level of that involvement was debatable. During the 1920s and early 1930s, it was negligible, and Luciano appears to have had almost zero involvement, as figures like him viewed it as hardly worth the effort when money could be made much more easily from bootlegging. In the mid-1930s, with Prohibition ending and the Great Depression continuing to impact on businesses countrywide, the illegal variety included, Luciano and his many associates did become involved in prostitution in New York. But even then, he viewed it as a small sideline which didn't generate a lot of money. His role was certainly peripheral enough that at least some of the evidence presented against him in court was exaggerated. More broadly, Dewey had made the court case a prosecution of Luciano's wider life and career, for much of which he had only speculation and hearsay to go on. The judge had been happy to proceed on this basis, however, and in the end, Luciano was convicted in a manner which was excessive based on the available evidence. Luciano appealed his conviction, but to no avail. He was going to prison. There he would try to maintain some role in the running of New York's underworld. However, for the most part, Vito Genovese took over as acting head of the Luciano crime family, with Frank Costello succeeding him within a year as Genovese fled to Italy after Dewey began focusing on his activities, notably the murder of Ferdinand Boccia in 1934. Luciano was originally sent to Sing Sing prison, a place where when it was first built, the cells measured 7 foot by 3.5 foot and were just 6.5 foot from floor to ceiling. New, saner cells were built in the 1920s and 1930s, but Sing Sing deserved its fearsome reputation. Luckily for Lucky Luciano, he was quickly moved from there to Dannemora prison, though things were far from pleasant here either. Dannemora was notoriously cold and was dubbed Siberia by the inmates. Luciano quickly established himself as the most important prisoner, brokering a peace between rival gangs and evidently bribing a significant enough portion of the guards that the conditions of his detention became relatively pleasant. That said, Dannemora lay further upstate in New York, and he found it nigh on impossible to continue to play a role in managing affairs in New York in the late 1930s. By the time Lucky's minimum sentence of 30 years in prison would have been served, it would have been 1966. He would have been nearing his 70th year, and there is no guarantee he would have been released at that juncture. As such, Luciano would almost certainly have spent most of the rest of his life in an American prison, serving out the pandering conviction had it not been for events far away in Europe. On the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, leading Britain and France to declare war on it 2 days later, in the inception of the Second World War. In the second half of 1940, after Italy entered the war, North Africa became a major theatre of the conflict, as the Italians and Germans tried to secure the Suez Canal in Egypt. When the US entered the conflict in December 1941, after Germany's ally, the Empire of Japan, attacked the Pacific Fleet at anchor in Pearl Harbor, the US and Britain decided to prioritize the North Africa campaign, with a view to securing the Maghreb and then opening a southern front in Europe by launching an invasion of Sicily and southern Italy. As these plans were developed, the administration of President Roosevelt in Washington began to consider forming an alliance with the Italian Mafia to aid them with their contacts in Italy. It would be Luciano's salvation. On the 9th of February 1942, almost exactly 2 months after the US entered the war, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the SS Normandy, a French ship which had been captured by the US and was rechristened as the Lafayette, with ambitions to repurpose it as a troop carrier for the war effort, caught fire while undergoing repair work in New York Harbor. It sank the following day. In the days that followed, suspicions arose that the fire had been intentionally started by a German agent of some kind. This was one of the key reasons why the US government approached a number of figures within the Italian and Jewish crime syndicates of New York, including Luciano's close friend and ally, Meyer Lansky, in the spring of 1942. They hoped to use the mob's massive influence over New York's docklands and workers to prevent further arson attacks and to block foreign agents from coming in through the port. Early on in these talks, Luciano's imprisonment became a point of discussion. He was moved to Great Meadow Correctional Facility closer to New York, a much more comfortable situation for him, and promises were made that in return for his aid, his sentence would be commuted once the war ended. In return, the US government would have the cooperation of the Cosa Nostra, the Sicilian Mafia, in managing the port of New York and the labor unions for the duration of the war. Luciano also promised to use his contacts in Sicily and southern Italy to facilitate the Allied invasion of the peninsula as much as possible. This entire arrangement is typically known as Operation Underworld, though it is a major point of debate as to whether the government viewed it as a formal arrangement or operation. The extent to which Luciano managed to aid the government is somewhat conjectural. It is, for instance, believed that he put the US government in contact with Calogero Vizzini, the most powerful figure within Cosa Nostra back in Sicily itself. Legend has it that during the Allied invasion of the island in the summer of 1943, Vizzini spent a week riding around between the towns and villages of Sicily in an American tank, convincing people to lay down their arms and welcome the Americans. Meanwhile, in New York, Costello, Lansky, and others facilitated a wide range of other measures which the government required. While many historians have cast doubt on the significance of Luciano's aid to the government during the Second World War, there is no doubt that in January 1946, once the conflict was over, his sentence was commuted and he was released from prison, after serving just 9.5 years of a 30 to 50-year prison sentence. That said, nobody in Washington was anxious to have him hanging around in New York. The terms of his release were that he was to be deported back to Italy immediately. As such, after one last meal with some of his associates since the 1920s, on board the ship that would convey him back to the homeland, Luciano was deported from America on the 10th of February 1946. Lucky arrived in Naples 2.5 weeks later. He seems to have had little intention of staying there. Instead, he intended to relocate to Cuba. The Caribbean island had been a quasi-American colony for over 4 decades, ever since the Spanish-American War of 1898 had ousted the Spanish from the island and allowed the US to set up a system of oversight, which allowed it to largely decide who was in charge of the country. Usually the individuals so chosen were wildly corrupt, and as well as being closely aligned with Washington, the island had also become an offshore playground for the Mafia, one where gambling was legal and a few dollars could lead to blind eyes being turned quite easily. It was also close enough to the US that Luciano could keep a hand in running affairs in New York without the fear of extradition. And so in the autumn of 1946, he set off for Cuba, taking a circuitous route through several South and Central American countries, to ensure that he shrugged off any American or Italian police who were monitoring his movements. He arrived in the capital Havana in October 1946. Within days of arriving in Cuba, Luciano was organizing a major meeting of the heads of the Italian and Jewish mafias from New York and further afield. The Havana Conference took place at the Hotel Nacional from the 22nd of December 1946 onwards, continuing through Christmas. There were a wide range of things to be discussed. A notable topic was the mob's growing involvement in the development of Las Vegas. Bugsy Siegel, a Jewish-American mobster who had been involved with Luciano and many others since the 1920s, had been the visionary behind the Mafia's quest to establish a gambling oasis out west. But his management of the construction and opening of the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas had been disastrous, and Siegel had clearly lined his own pockets with the mob's investments while working on it. Lansky, who had known Bugsy since they were teenagers in New York, but when the Flamingo's opening night was a shambles, a decision was taken to murder Siegel, and he was killed in Los Angeles in the summer of 1947. Other issues discussed included narcotics, the unions, gambling, the Italian lottery in New York, and the respective positions of Genovese and Costello in New York, Genovese having returned from Italy after the war ended. Eventually, Luciano met with Genovese alone, and after a discussion in which Vito urged him to claim the title of Boss of Bosses and then let him exercise the position on the ground in America, Luciano angrily told him he didn't want to ever hear the idea mentioned again. With the end of the Havana meeting, most of the attendees headed back to the US and resumed their operations. Luciano, of course, could not. He remained on in Havana, enjoying the fact that for once he was not being observed by either the US or Italian police. Quite the contrary, in fact. Instead, he was something of a local celebrity, one who met regularly with the Cuban president, Ramon Grau, and was invited to social occasions by prominent American businessmen with interests in Havana. Those who knew him at the time stated later that this was a period in which he was quite happy with his circumstances. Inevitably, it didn't last. By the spring of 1947, journalists in Cuba had begun to receive reports that the Mafia Don was living in Havana, and as photos of him appeared in a growing number of newspapers, American political agents in Cuba had to act. Pressure was applied on Grau's administration by restricting the import of various medicines to Cuba from America, and with this, the government in Havana politely detained Luciano in March 1947 and informed him that he was to be deported back to Italy. Thus, in mid-March, he boarded the Bakir ship bound for Europe. Although he paid $300 for a first-class cabin, he was reported to have spent much of his time playing cards with tourists in economy as he headed east back to his homeland. It has been speculated that the details of his presence in Cuba were leaked by some of his associates after the conference, fearing that Luciano intended to try to continue running affairs in New York from Havana. While the post-war period saw Luciano being prevented from playing a leading role in the Italian-American Mafia, following his release from prison, his personal life did shift after his return to Italy from Cuba. He had never married or had children and seemed to have no interest in doing so. Yet in early 1948, he did begin a relationship with a woman whom he would term the love of his life. Igea Lissoni was a 26-year-old woman whom Luciano first met in Milan. She was a dancer who had performed at the La Scala Opera House in her youth. Luciano was apparently too shy to ask her out when they first met, but later he attended a nightclub in Rome where she was performing, and before long they were seeing one another. She moved into his Rome apartment just a few weeks later. "She's the only girl I ever loved," Luciano later related. Due to the police continuously harassing Lucky in Rome, they eventually had to move to Naples, where they lived in a penthouse apartment on the Via Tasso with a panoramic view of Mount Vesuvius and the Bay of Naples. They would never have children though, with Luciano claiming he didn't want any child to grow up tarred with being Lucky Luciano's child. Luciano and Lissoni lived a somewhat quiet life in Naples, despite the efforts of the Italian police to continue digging up information on his alleged criminal activity. There was no doubt that there was some illegal activity. One of Luciano's pastimes was visiting the horse tracks in Naples, where he invariably won. The races were undoubtedly fixed at least some of the time. Other than this, he continued to have contacts with the Italian Mafia, although less so with people back in America, meeting people who visited Italy from New York, but little more than that. Police reports from the 1950s noted that he continued to spend considerably more money than he was earning through any legal channels, yet they could never make anything stick to him. This quiet and relatively happy period of his life came to an end in October 1958, when Lissoni died of breast cancer at just 36 years of age. Friends noted he cried at her funeral, something they had never seen before. A magazine article for which he had been interviewed and which appeared not long after Lissoni's death described him as a tight-lipped individual who met many questions with silence. The same interviewer concluded that, quote, "His life is a quiet one, and his greatest desire is to forget and be forgotten." At the same time that Luciano was living his relatively quiet life in Italy, one which surely felt like an exile, yet was actually a return to his homeland, a rivalry was brewing in New York between two of his oldest allies. Genovese never accepted the fact that Costello had succeeded him as the head of the Luciano crime family in New York after he fled to Italy in the late 1930s. Costello's unwillingness to relinquish the position after the war when Genovese returned to America was a source of growing tension between the two figures. Costello's position was weakened in the early 1950s by the Kefauver hearings, where the US Senate forced him and many other figures to testify about the existence of an organized crime syndicate amongst Italian Americans. Finally, in 1957, Genovese tried to have Costello murdered. He survived the attempted hit carried out by Vincent the Chin Gigante. However, Costello decided to retire and allow Genovese to take over at this juncture, rather than engaging in a bloody and possibly protracted power struggle. With this, Genovese became the head of the Luciano crime family, but ironically, the man after whom the outfit was named was never happy with this decision far away in Italy. It has been suggested on more than one occasion that Luciano was in some way involved when charges were pressed against Genovese in New York not long after he took over affairs there. Genovese was implicated in a large sale of narcotics and would eventually be sentenced to 15 years in prison in 1959. He surrendered himself and began his sentence in 1960, and would die in prison in 1969. There is certainly a case to be made that the incident which brought Genovese down, an alleged deal with a low-level Puerto Rican drug dealer, seems curious. Why would Genovese have been directly involved in such a deal, instead of letting a minion handle it? Whether Luciano, who had been visited on a few occasions in Naples by agents of the US Federal Bureau of Narcotics in the late 1950s, was involved remains speculative, though friends who knew him in Italy in his later years did recount that news of Genovese's conviction and imprisonment was one of the few things that cheered Luciano up in the months following Lissoni's death. Luciano's final years were spent living in Naples. Somewhat surprisingly, he was not especially well off during these years, in part because much of his revenue was coming in from Havana, and after the success of the Cuban Revolution, the Mafia's activities there came to an end in 1959. While the changing of the guard in New York saw much of the residual payments he received from there over the years dry up. He resented this, and it rubbed salt in the wound when Joey Adonis, one of Luciano's gunmen back in the 1920s and a much more junior figure in the mob in general, arrived in Italy in 1956 after agreeing to be deported from America after a perjury charge, setting himself up in Milan in a grand mansion where he held court in a manner which Luciano was financially incapable of. It was in an effort to turn his ailing financial situation around that he agreed to discuss a movie project based on his life with Martin Gosch in the early 1960s. The timing seemed propitious, as a feature film starring Rod Steiger on the life of Al Capone had appeared in 1959, and Murder, Inc., another gangster film, was released a year later. In the last months of his life, Luciano had been in contact with Gosch and was laying the groundwork for such a film, though how this project would have been received by those who were still active in the Mafia is very debatable. As it turned out, the film would never come to fruition. On the evening of the 26th of January 1962, Luciano headed to Capodichino Airport in Naples to meet Gosch as he got off a plane flying in from Rome. They were planning to complete the work on the movie script over the next several days. Instead, Luciano collapsed as they walked from the terminal. When a doctor attended shortly afterwards, he pronounced him dead. He had passed of a heart attack at 64 years of age. Word quickly spread out internationally, with news of his death featuring the following day on the front page of the New York Times. There were other revelations in the days that followed about how Lucky was under investigation at the time of his death for his role in a $150 million narcotics ring between Europe and the US, which had been operating for decades. Luciano's funeral was held 3 days later in Naples. Approximately 300 guests attended, doubtlessly a smaller number than would have been the case had he died in New York. The ceremony was disturbed by scuffles which broke out when over-enthusiastic photojournalists got too close to the mourners. His body was originally taken by a horse-drawn hearse to Poggio Reale Cemetery on the outskirts of Naples, but an arrangement was subsequently reached whereby his body was repatriated to America. 2,000 mourners attended his burial in Queens. By the time Luciano died, investigations into the extent of the Mafia's activities were escalating in America. Genovese was already in prison. In 1963, Joseph Valacchi gave testimony to U.S. Senate hearings in which he revealed how the organized Mafia in America had come into being, including the central role Luciano had played in the creation of the commission back in 1931. Although it took 20 years for the tide to turn, by the 1980s all of these revelations and attacks on the Mafia's extensive involvement in the narcotics trade, gambling and control of labor and the unions began to pay off. That decade saw their influence in Las Vegas vanquished and widespread arrests and successful prosecutions. A half a century after he built it up in the early 1930s, Luciano's Mafia was beginning to decline. In 1998, when it published its list of the 100 most important persons of the 20th century, Time magazine included Charles Lucky Luciano in its list of builders and titans on account of his role in the emergence of the Italian-American Mafia as the foremost criminal enterprise in the United States during the 20th century. He featured in this particular section of the list alongside Walt Disney, Henry Ford, Bill Gates, and Ray Kroc, respectively the pioneers behind Disney, Ford Automobiles, Microsoft, and McDonald's. It was a left-of-center choice by Time and entirely fitting at the same time. Luciano was the most significant figure in the history of the Italian-American Mafia, emerging out of the East Side in the late 1910s and forged through Prohibition. He came out of the pivotal Castellamarese War of the early 1930s as the most powerful Mafia figure in New York, and countrywide by extension. At that juncture, he could have continued the divisive attempts to claim absolute power, which had led to conflict for many years. But instead, he elected to rule as the first of equals, and in the process allowed the Mafia to begin strengthening its network on a national level, and expanding into new cities and to develop operations as far afield as Las Vegas, Nevada, and Havana, Cuba. Although owing to his arrest and incarceration in 1936, he was eclipsed during much of his later life by figures like Genovese and Costello, there is no doubting that for better or for worse, Lucky Luciano was the single most important figure in the history of the Italian-American Mafia.
Okay, in this segment, I'm going to be talking about how they pulled off the deal against the Japanese. And I am not going to be covering the Gary Webb and the Iran-Contra case in this file about the Mafia. It's becoming too much. So what I'm going to be doing is I pulled that aside. I'll do that in the next few days because the Iran-Contra thing, it's all been confirmed. It's how well, a lot of black people got killed. A lot of people are still in prison today. So I want to give the story its true telling, and today's just not the day. So I will be getting back to that. So in this segment, I'm going to be talking about the Chicago group. But first, allegedly, the secret name for these Cascarian mafia chieftains, which run much of the world out of the city of London, is Gog and Magog, Magog, despite what so many historians believe is a secret name of Russia, which it is not. It is the secret name of the top KM and apparently represents where they originally came from. The big question remains, was the true cause of leaders of the Khazarian mafia's incredible evil and savagery toward the human race a byproduct of nature or nurture? Some believe that this gross parasitism and inclination to mass murder, engagement in pedophilia and child bloodletting and child sacrifice is due to a toxic culture best described as malignant tribalism, characterized by a paranoid group racial superiority delusion. Others think the leaders of the KM are the bloodline of Cain, that is, children of Cain, that are the devil's own and have absolutely no soul or human conscience and are pure predators like a wild beast, while at the same time incredibly two-faced, that is able to put on a good con and a nice face on the outside. Perhaps it could be both factors. In any case, it is time to expose this evil. It is time for the world to eradicate it. And this is what's really interesting. Well, they're psychopaths. Psychopaths fit the criteria of no conscience, inability to display empathy. They hid the name psychopath and what the term meant on purpose. That got taken care of by Cleckley. Cleckley was the godfather of psychopathy research. He was the one who made sure the name was really never defined. Cleckley himself was a psychopath, unless you can call him a good guy who was putting people into coma, working in mental hospitals, and doing unlimited horrors. He was also involved in rigging our nutritional support. And then after Cleckley came Robert Hare, the known guy right now who claims to be the official researcher for psychopaths. Bob Hare took over Cleckley's work. For all these years, Bob Hare said his work was based on Cleckley. I guess Hare never really read what Cleckley was up to. Because would you say that you were taking over somebody's work if their work meant putting people into comas, electroshock treatments, all kinds of horrible things done in mental institutions? Would you model your work after that person and then publicly brag about it? I keep telling you, these psychopaths do not hear themselves talk, nor do they understand who we are. So they hid the term on purpose. And it has many, many aspects because if you're involved with a psychopath, and you never get closure, everybody says to you, probably just a narcissist. And you say, no, it's worse than that. I saw those evil eyes. Yeah, well, you're lucky you aren't dead because Ted Bundy killed all his victims. So see what I'm saying? So what happened was that all over social media, YouTube, you got all these lousy therapists who are talking about narcissism only. So yeah, so it becomes very complicated for the people involved in these relationships because they never get a clear idea of exactly what they were dealing with. And that's why when I started this podcast, the first year and a half, I did 15-minute segments every single week so that you could learn on your own in the future and whenever without the aid of anybody but your own self to figure out, were you involved with a psychopath? Are you involved with one now? Because it never got defined. And that lack of definition caused great harm to people. So anyway, and these mafia Russians, okay, let me tell you this right now. I'm going to give you a little bit more about who some of these people relate to today. Now that we know more about the the KM group, that mafia group, right? Bugsy Siegel, we all know that name, right? Bugsy Siegel, that was a guy who started Las Vegas and it got killed. They killed Bugsy Siegel. He did some things wrong and they take out their own all the time. But anyway, so Bugsy Siegel, both of his parents were Russian Jews. So that means Bugsy Siegel came from Ashkenazi Jews, specifically from Russia over there by Ukraine, right? John Gotti Jr., his mother was a Russian Jew. Well, now that we know what that means, right? Another mobster named Dutch Schultz. Both of his parents were German Jews. Meyer Lansky. Meyer Lansky, you'll hear a lot about. Very smart mobster, very short little man. Meyer Lansky, both of his parents were Russian Jews. Jake Guzik, Guzik, both of his parents were Polish Jews. Starting to see the patterns here? Yeah, these gypsies were then hiding as Jews, right? And then they became mafia. That's all it is. So anyway, so the Japanese people, just to give you a flavor here, there was an interview with a man whose father lost his business. He lost a $10,000 restaurant, never compensated, not a penny. And the minute we went in camp, they just go right in there and steal everything. They won't buy it. They knew we were going into camp, so why buy it when you could get it for free? And that's what they did. You know, when I think about that restaurant, it had stainless steel in the kitchen, all the working table and everything were custom made. And we had a small walk-in freezer. It's unheard of. And even then, the dishwashing rack, huh? Not tin, but stainless. It was pretty fancy restaurant. Japanese American farmers were also hard hit by their forced incarceration, and their losses translated into gains for many white investors. The United States is the most racist country in the entire planet. And the reason they're so racist is because they want to hide their own black past. Wakey, wakey, kids, wakey, wakey. They hate the people that were here first, who, in fact, were the black folks, right? They scrubbed them out. They invented white people because right now, the white Christians are the ones that are coming for the rest of us. The white Christians have all become Zionists, so it's pretty crazy, right? So now the white Christians are the ones who are supposedly aiming to take out the rest of us. Japanese American farmers were also hit hard by their forced incarceration, and their losses translated into gains for many white investors. By 1942, the managing secretary of the Western Growers Protective Association reported that considerable profits were realized by the growers and the shippers because of the Japanese removal. In 1948, President Truman signed the Japanese American Evacuation Claims Act into law with the intent that it would provide I said, compensation for the economic loss suffered during World War II. However, there's always a catch, right? However, the requirements for providing loss and other red tape rendered the program largely ineffective. Some historians said the former inmates were required to provide sworn testimony and to produce receipts and other proof of their losses. Now, keep in mind, these people were removed from their homes with very little time to even pack a bag or put a sweater on, okay? This is exactly the same thing they did during San Francisco. They claimed it was an earthquake, but it was really firebombing. And those people, the same thing. People went around with guns and they were forced to be removed from their homes in San Francisco. And everything got robbed and stolen. Rinse and repeat, right? So they're swept out of their homes, but then they're forced to have to provide sworn testimony and to produce receipts and other proof of their losses. If their claim amounted to over $2,500, they were required, in effect, to sue the government for damages and await fresh appropriation of funds to pay the claims. The Justice Department strongly contested each claim. using a legalistic definition of what could be counted as a loss. Decades later, the redress movement would succeed in achieving some monetary restitution to account for some of these losses in signing the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. Keep in mind, when was the war? 42, right? So 40 years later, they were awarded $20,000. Why didn't they just walk up and spit in their faces? Hey, there you go. We spit in your face. So they were awarded $20,000 to each living survivor of incarceration. President Reagan acknowledged the act was only a fraction of America's moral and financial debt to Japanese Americans. Their payment can make up for those lost years, he said. So what is most important in this bill has less to do with property than with honor. For here we admit a wrong. I can't even believe it. They admitted they were wrong. Mark down this date in history. Within a couple of years, these federal holdings swelled to include 500,000 acres of California's best farmland, some 1,265 small Japanese-owned hotels, and numerous urban parcels through Los Angeles, San Jose, and other cities, all being held by the government. In 1942, the federal government estimated the value of these, see, they're already saying former Japanese American properties at around $3 billion in present day dollars. But the huge post-war California economic and population boom would surely have greatly increased the worth of this real estate portfolio by the early 1950s. The business assets and patent holdings of the seized German companies were also worth an additional billions. So the key in this fire sale liquidation of alien assets was David L. Bazelon, Bazelon. David lived from 1909 to 1993, a well-connected attorney out of Chicago and son of Russian Jewish immigrants. He was an active supporter of Roosevelt and Truman and became friendly with people connected within the Truman Association. He was part of the corrupt posse that included J. Edgar Hoover, Justice William O. Douglas, Lyndon B. Johnson, and Justice William J. Brennan. In 1946, Bazelon left private practice for the last time to join the U.S. Justice Department as Assistant Attorney General in charge of the Land Division. Now, isn't that handy? He soon moved to head the Department of Office of Alien Property, where he oversaw the disposition of the assets of more than 200 companies previously owned by Germans or Japanese whose assets had been frozen during the war. After the war, all of this property needed to be sold off, and powerful Chicago crime syndicate, here we are. That's why I keep saying, look at the beginning, right? So the gang out of Chicago, the Pritzkers and that mob. So all of this property needed to be sold off. And powerful Chicago crime syndicate interests recognized this tremendous opportunity. The 1946 elections produced a crushing national defeat for the ruling Democrats, with the Republicans gaining control of both houses of Congress for the first time since 1932. President Truman thus faced a desperate battle for re-election, and Chicago's powerful political machine deployed its considerable political clout to place the sales process in the hands of Bazelon, a leading Democratic fundraiser with deep syndicate ties. Boy, isn't that convenient? Bazelon took a pay cut of 80% to enter government service. And I like how they say, well, Elon doesn't have to do this to help Americans. Elon is only here to help the rest of us. Why do I always say evil has to come packaged as help? So this Bazelon person takes a pay cut of 80% to enter government service, but he soon boasted to the Washington Post that he had become one of the largest businessmen in the world. See what I'm saying? They just don't know how to moderate their speech, right? Now, if you had ripped off all this money, would you be out blabbing to the Washington Post? I would think not, right? So open mouth, insert ugly mafia feet. Okay, so he took an 80% pay cut. Then he brags to the Washington Post that he became one of the largest businessmen in the country. His motive quickly became apparent as he arranged the liquidation of assets for a fraction of real value to his circle of Chicago friends and associates, sometimes receiving a secret slice of the lucrative ownership stakes in return. As an example, Bazelon almost immediately sold to fellow Jew Chicago Henry Crown a 26,000-acre California mine containing tens of millions of dollars worth of coal for a mere $150,000. A private $1 million sale of seized German property in 1948 to a group formed by his lifelong best friend and former law partner Paul Zigfried was worth $40 million by 1954. And Zifrin soon rewarded Bazelon with a 9.2 share of his multi-million-dollar real estate holding company. Ziffin was an associate of Sidney Korshak. Emblaze that name in your mind. Korshak, Korshak. Sidney Korshak, a highly connected fixer and lawyer in the upper echelons of power and the Chicago outfit in the United States. His reputation as the Chicago mob's man in Los Angeles made him one of Hollywood's most fabled and influential wheeler dealers. His partnership with Chicago mobsters led him to be named the most powerful lawyer in the world by the FBI. Korshak was a principal figure in Andy Russo's book Super Mob. I'm reading that book right now. It is an excellent read. Another major beneficiary of Bazelon's unusual sales practices later told a congressional investigation committee that he gave Bazelon a 25% share of his large hotel holding company because he was just feeling good and generous and was grateful. These particular hidden gifts to Bazelon only came to light years later through chance references that were eventually uncovered by diligent researchers. So we may assume that such transactions probably represented just the tip of an enormous iceberg. It seems plausible that Bazelon received quiet kickbacks totaling many millions, or perhaps even tens of millions in present-day dollars, in exchange for his very favorable distribution of billions in government assets to the network of beneficiaries who shared his roots in the Chicago syndicate. This vast transfer of wealth in the early post-war years from the plundered Nisi gave all these mobbed-up Chicago newcomers the financial wherewithal to soon gain substantial control of California's money-based political system. As Art White, the veteran Los Angeles political journalist, later described the situation, during these years, some hundreds of associates of Greenberg, Evans, and others of the Capone crime syndicate and of Avery and Zifrin poured hundreds of millions of dollars into California. They bought real estate, including hotel chains, though apparently unrelated corporations from San Diego to Sacramento. They invested in vast tracts of land, built or bought motels, giant office buildings, and other commercial properties. More importantly, they invaded the loan field, establishing banks and home loans and institutions. By 1953, Zifrin and his associates had gained control of an enormous block of California's economy. They could finance political campaigns with the best of the native barons. In the book, Russo notes that the FBI analysts subsequently endorsed White's conclusions. Another key figurehead in the Asian grifting operation was Earl Warren, governor of California from 1943 to 1953, who was a running mate with Thomas Dewey, another corrupto. He was president in 1948 and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court from 1953 to 1969. That was Earl Warren. Warren was a very active after 1910 in Freemasonry and of the Independent Order of Oddfellows. He rose through the ranks in the Masons, culminating in his election in 1935 as a Grand Master of the Freemasons for the state of California from 1935 to 1936. Biographer Jim Newton wrote that Warren thrived on the Masons because he shared their ideals, but those ideals also helped shape him, deepening his conviction that society's problems were best addressed by a small group of enlightened, well-meaning citizens. I guess by that he means a small group of gangsters and thugs, right? Some of Warren's well-meaning positions included eugenics, forced sterilizations, and the confiscation of land from the Japanese owners during World War II. Warren, who was a member of the outspoken Anti-Asia Society, Native Sons of the Golden West, successfully sought legislation expanding the land confiscations. Ultimately, after nearly a half a century, and well after the loot was in the hands of the predators, arrangements were made to have American taxpayers pay restitution. Isn't that how it always works, right? Congress passed and President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act. The surviving 82,219 Japanese Americans who had been incarcerated were each sent a formal apology from Reagan and awarded $20,000 each. The first payments were made in October 1990 to the oldest Japanese Americans. The program concluded in 1999. Well, of course, flip those nines up and you got 3 sixes, right? What happened to Bazelon? Well, the controversial Bazelon went on to become United States Circuit Judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. He was an influencer towards a more liberal Supreme Court selections. He was in particular a close associate of Justice William J. Brennan Jr., whom he had met in 1956. Bazelon became a primary source of Justin Brennan's law clerks. Bazelon's former law clerks included prominent legal figures and functionaries such as Loftus Becker, Alan Dershowitz, Martha Minow, Thomas Merrill, John Sexton, Robert Post, David O. Stewart, Eleanor Swift, Barbara Underwood, and John Koshkin. Bazelon had a broad view of the reach of the Constitution. He expanded, this is a good one, he expanded the scope of the insanity defense. And Bazelon also worked with Cleckley and them on that insanity defense. That's the funny part, right? They always want to call all of us crazy, right? so he expanded the scope of the insanity defense in the landmark case of Durham versus United States in 1945 toward an expanded view of criminal rights. Under Bazelon's Durham rule, a defendant would be excused from criminal responsibility if a jury found that the unlawful act was the product of mental disease or mental defect. rather than the product of an irresistible impulse, which was the old test. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this cocaine business because all the money, and they found that I think the average body they sell, they can get about $150,000 per body. That's before they kill them, which, these kids and stuff, um, when you figure the overall cost of the body, what they get for part, I know this sounds very cruel, but all the parts and all that, they're looking at 150. So what's going on with more of the trafficking of people is because there's more money in that, but I believe they're strongly doing both. So let's have a little refresher on what's going on with all this stuff. Okay. Cocoa leaves and poppies are entirely different plants that produce different types of psychoactive substances. So they're two different places, right? Cocoa leaves turn into cocaine. Cocaine is derived from the leaves of the cocoa plant, which is native to South America. So, cocaine is a stimulant, meaning it increases energy, alertness, and euphoria, while also raising heart rate and blood pressure. So, cocoa leaves undergo a chemical process involving solvents, and that would be kerosene, gasoline, sulfuric acid, etc., to extract and refine cocaine into its purest forms. Then we have the poppy. The poppy gets turned into opium, morphine, and heroin. Because I really always I have to remind myself of what these things are, right? The opium poppy is the plant that produces opium latex, which contains alkaloids like morphine and codeine. So they're getting the cocaine leaves that turn into the cocaine, right? Excuse me, the coca leaves, which turn into cocaine, and then the poppy plants turn into opium, morphine, and heroin. So, unlike cocoa leaves, poppies contain opioids, not stimulants. Morphine is the main psychoactive compound extracted from the latex of the poppy pod. Opioids are depressants, meaning they slow down the central nervous system, providing pain relief, relaxation, and euphoria. Morphine from opium can be chemically altered to produce heroin, which is a much more potent opioid. So we got that right. So what they're doing is there's different places, and I have a lot of this down below, and there's different places where this comes from. But for today's purposes, we don't need to get overly hung up on where it's coming from. I've been trying to explore where it is coming from along the trade routes, but it would be a little bit too much to try to start to talk about the trade routes today. Um, because basically, let me give you an example. Opium poppies, heroin, and opioid production. Opioid poppy cultivation is spread across different continents, with major production centers in Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. Specifically, number one, we have Afghanistan. That's why they were in Afghanistan for that war, right? Afghanistan is the world's largest producer of illicit opium, supplying most of the heroin to Europe and Asia. Myanmar in Burma, second largest producer with the Golden Triangle, Myanmar, Thailand, and Laos being a historic drug hub. Mexico, main supplier of heroin to the U.S., particularly black tar heroin. So they go through all these different things, and people do know where all these routes are because I was able to look them up via chat GPT. So that is where the money is through those two things, through those opioids and then through the cocaine. And they're still doing it today. So they're also processing them in more specific places and then controlling them in different places around the world. For example, cocaine is primarily produced in Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, then smuggled to North America, Europe, and Africa. But the main cocaine smuggling routes South America to the United States via Mexico. So cocaine from Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia is smuggled north through land routes. And so, yeah, and they take all these different routes, but these routes are all pretty well known and people seem to know what they are. I was able to find them. So, Um, so, and that is all being controlled by the mafia, right? There's another mafia you're going to hear a lot about. I don't think for today's purposes we need to know every bit about every mafia, but there's a few. We have the five mafia families in the United States that started out, right? Then we have the mafia group out of Chicago. And over in Italy, the one group I keep running into is the Ndrangheta. That's Ndrangheta. So the Ndrangheta, that's the one you want to pay attention to, okay? That seems to be the vicious one that's kind of at the head of the Italian groups, okay? And so I was looking into them because I kept reading about them. It said Italy's mafia groups, particularly the Ndrangheta, have been known to launder drug money through the agriculture industry. 'Cause remember, last show or so I was talking about the mafia controls 80% of the tomatoes. So, and they control the tomato market for the laundering of money. So be careful where you buy your pasta sauce from. Okay, so I went back and looked at that specifically because it'd be too much to try to look at it all. But anyway, so the Ndrangheta, they're the ones that are in the agriculture business, and they're the ones doing the tomatoes that I was talking about last time. So the Ndrangheta, it's Italy's most powerful cocaine trafficking syndicate, and they're also the ones in the tomato business. So anyway, so what they do, I look more because I'm interested in tomatoes and I like odd details. So how do they run the tomato business? Well, the mafia run businesses. What they do is they inflate prices on tomato shipments, billing much more than their actual cost. Example, selling 5 million lira of tomatoes, but only shipping 500,000 worth. The rest is laundered drug money. So they say they're shipping so much, but they're not really. I mean, these people really stay up late at night trying to figure this stuff out. And so they say that cartels create fake export records for food shipments that never actually exist. Fake companies buy and sell tomatoes between themselves, making it look like a legitimate business. So, and in the last show, I was talking about the tomato business. They also go around to immigrant centers and lure people into going out and working for them for cheap, right? And they also, if they can't get them to work on the tomato field, they get them to do prostitution stuff. So, yeah, who knew there was so much about tomatoes, right? But there's even more. The Ndrangheta, they own farms, factories, distribution centers, and grocery chains in Italy and across Europe. Cocaine profits get mixed into these businesses as legitimate revenue. So, because mafia controlled companies export tomatoes, olive oil, and cheese to Germany, Canada, the US, and Australia. These international deals make it easier to move large amounts of cocaine cash into legal markets. So, also, I found another piece that said mafia controlled agriculture, not just tomatoes. The Italian mafia launders money through many food products, not just tomatoes. Olive oil, known as mafia oil, often mixed with lower quantity oils and resold as premium. Yeah, you do have to be careful of what olive oil you buy because a lot of it is polluted. Okay. Cheese and dairy. Fake invoices used for mozzarella and Parmigiano exports. Wine and citrus fruits. Mafia owned vineyards and farms used for money laundering. Supermarket and restaurants. Mafia invests in food supply chains and franchises to clean cash. And then why tomatoes work so well for money laundering. Everyday essential. Tomato sauce and canned tomatoes are used worldwide, making transactions look normal. Yeah, they have a really good point there, don't they? So, tomato sauce and canned tomatoes are used worldwide, making transactions look normal. Hard to track. Unlike luxury goods, food products are less scrutinized by authorities. Another excellent point. Large market size. Italy exports millions and tons of tomatoes. hiding dirty money in a sea of legal transactions. And I might add, what kind of tomatoes are these? Roma tomatoes. So all the tomatoes are pretty much Roma tomatoes. So, just like Roma, Rome, gypsies, corrupt supply chain, mafia infiltration, agriculture makes it easy to manipulate records. Recent mafia busts involving food and cocaine money. In 2021, Italy and Spain cracked down. Authorities seized 1 billion worth of assets, including farms, supermarkets, and food companies linked to the Ndrangheta group. In 2020, Germany-Italy raid. It was called Operation Polinio. They discovered that cocaine profits were laundered through pizza restaurants and olive oil exports. 2018 agro-mafia investigation. They found that mafia-run farms were laundering drug money through the production of fake organic food. Global impact, cocaine money and tomatoes. The Ndrangheta supplies 80% of Europe's cocaine and moves billions in illegal profits. Italian mafia exports food products worldwide, meaning laundered money reaches supermarkets in the US, Canada, and Australia. Authorities struggle to track food-based laundering because the transactions appear legal. The bottom line, tomatoes are being used to launder cocaine money, but it's just one piece of a massive food-based laundering system. The Italian mafia's control over agriculture and international trade makes it one of the most powerful and secretive drug money machines in the world. Yeah, next time you look at a can of tomatoes, remember this story. The Ndrangheta, based in Calabria, Italy, is the world's biggest cocaine trafficker, controlling 80. So the next time you take a snort of cocaine, I'm just kidding. Think of the Ndrangheta's. The Ndrangheta's are based in Calabria, Italy, is the world's biggest cocaine trafficker, controlling 80% of Europe's cocaine trade and operating in over 40 countries. Unlike the Sicilian Mafia or the Cosa Nostra or Naples Cameron, the Ndrangheta operates under the radar, making billions while avoiding the spotlight. Unlike other mafias that rely on the middlemen, the Ndrangheta deals directly with the South American cartels. So yeah, they work with all the other thugs out there, right? So once the cocaine is sourced, the Ndrangheta moves massive shipments into Europe. And of course, it's being right up there in Brussels, right? Here's how it works. Cocaine is hidden in shipping containers carrying bananas, coffee, and seafood. The ports are controlled by the Ndrangheta. Now, isn't that convenient that they control all the ports, right? In Giallo Taro, Italy, the biggest mafia-controlled port. Antwerp, Belgium, main cocaine gateway to Europe. Rotterdam, Netherlands, cartel-linked corruption. Venezuela and Barcelona, Spain, entry for South American drugs. So there's all your entry routes right there. The West Africa trade route. Cocaine is shipped to Guinea, Ghana, and Nigeria, then smuggled into Europe by land. African traffickers work with Ndrangheta to transport drugs into Italy, France, and Germany. Yeah, I think if you run into somebody and they go, "Hey, my family, they're from the Ndrangheta. What you doing over there?" I think you better say, "Oh, how nice to meet you." What a pleasant surprise. Say nothing and figure out how to get away from them. So anybody that says they're from Italy and they happen to be from the Ndrangheta, you probably don't want to talk to these people. Because they say that in banana shipments, cocaine is sealed inside fruit crates and shipped in refrigerated containers. Luxury cars and machinery. I've talked about this in the past where they send luxury cars to African places, money laundering. Well, what they do is they pack it with cocaine into hidden compartments of expensive cars and engines or farm equipment, yachts and private jets. cartel bosses use private luxury travel to move cocaine undetected. Inside human couriers or mules, the mules are the people that kind of carry it across the border. So whenever you read about them seizing a bunch of cocaine shipments, I can guarantee you this. Probably. Now remember, I'm just guessing here. Probably what they're doing is they're busting somebody that's their competition, right? So, yeah, so that's how they move all the money around, these mafia people. We do, I have a hard time not believing that we're living in a mafia-run world. It is becoming, I don't know, it seems pretty clear as a bell to me these days, but hey, I'm just sharing my work with you so you can hopefully come to your own conclusions. There's a few wars about here. Let me see here. Yeah, the Nagaratis, they've had some pretty vicious fights over time with people. I think, like I said, if you meet anybody that's part of that group, bow out. Figure out a way to ghost those people and get out of town. If you live near them, just figure out a way to go on vacation for a very long time. So yeah, Nagaratis, they have been involved in some of the deadliest mafia wars in history. They were in the Faida di San Luca War, 1991 to 2010. But I'm sure these people were really good fathers. I'm sure at the end of all this, they probably went home and, tucked their kids into bed and had a glass of milk with some cookies, patted the dog, said hello to the wife. So this one war, um, the San Lucas War, it was an eternal fight between two Nagarati clans, and that's the other thing to be aware of. It's not just the Nagaratis; they have all these other clans and stuff that run under them. But they got sparked into a bar fight in San Lucas, Calabria, which turned into a massacre. So, like I'm saying, you just hear that name and probably leave the area. So, and the law enforcement versus the Nagarati. Despite its secrecy, police forces have stepped up the fight against the Nagarati. So what they're doing is they're saying this. They're saying how law enforcement infiltrates the mafia. Well, we know in the United States they didn't infiltrate the mafia for a very long time on purpose, right? They let them get over here. They had prohibition to let them get a really big foothold into everything. Then they kept going along and along and along until the 60s. And gee, here we are now, and the mafia is still running things, right? And people today are still talking about, hey, you know what? You should unionize your job. Well, does anybody remember what happened to the last union jobs? The mafia, none of these people work. They're all parasites, right? So they look for opportunities where there's money sitting there. The doctors do it. If there's like a category they can bill, what they'll do is go in and find a bunch of people with that issue that they can actually bill to fix that fake issue or whatever it is. They're vultures, or like think about birds flying around the sky, zooming down on things. They find things like people have pension plans. The big famous one with the big mob cases here, very famous case. These workers had all these pension plans for them to retire on. So what do? They put a mob boss in charge, and so all their pensions get stolen. So they all operate under the same premise, but the mafia actual groups are just a little bit more reckless. And I think that when they changed over around Gotti time, first of all, the thugs they brought over from Italy in the early 1900s were very crude and rude and tough people, right? As time went on, they got more sophisticated. A couple of the mafia groups met up with the Chicago mafia groups, the Lansky people and stuff. They teamed up, and they brought a more sophisticated thing to the group. Then they started showing up wearing suits and stuff like that, and so much of the old thuggish ways were gone. And then I've been saying for a long time, and then the Gotti trials. The one thing that kept the mafia going was they kept their mouth shut, right? Nobody talked. That was part of the big secrecy thing. And Gotti went against all of that. So Gotti was the one who was all flash and out there, blah, 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 blah. And so the Gotti era really ended that particular kind of an era, but it did not make the mafia go away. Now we have homeowners associations running things. We have like many fiefdoms of mafia all over the place. So They claim that let me tell you a little bit about how law enforcement infiltrates the mafia, I guess when they get around to it. Undercover agents and informants. Extremely rare, but some defectors have given information, and you'll run into the name Donnie Brasco. Donnie Brasco, they make a big deal about him. You'll find him in all these mob movies and stuff. Donnie Brasco was an FBI informant who got into the mob. He was the first and only informant that got inside of the mob. This has all just been the plan, not the bug in the system, right? So then they also can use wiretaps and surveillance. And they say Italian police listen to coded conversations about drug shipments. They can extradite with international cooperation. Well, that's kind of out the window because they're all in on it, right? And then there was this, I asked this thing, will the Nagarati ever fail? Despite crackdowns, the Nagarati remains the world's wealthiest and most powerful mafia. Why it's so hard to destroy? Well, no informants. Unlike the Sicilian mafia, almost no Nagarati members become witnesses. Well, because what they do is, before you get to be a witness, you're going to be dead. So it's family based. The organization is built on bloodlines, making infiltration nearly impossible. Diversified operation. The Nagaraki controls legal businesses that fund their criminal empire. Yeah, the tomatoes, right? International reach. If Italian police crack down, they simply move operations abroad. So, only major weakness. If Mexican cartels, Albanian mafia, and European police forces team up, they could challenge Nagarati's dominance in the cocaine trade. But are they going to? Probably not. The Nagarati, like other powerful mafias, has perfected the art of assassination while avoiding police detection. Their methods are brutal, precise, and designed to leave no witnesses, no evidence, and no suspects. I was kind of wondering, I've been wondering, so far, I'm sitting here in this house in Nebraska. They have me fully plutoniumized coming into my house. Uh, I have wondered if they would try to send somebody out to get me because, well, I don't know, a lot of reasons. But, keep in mind, and I'm saying this because I would like for you to think about it also. I never thought that there would be a time that I would be talking about actually having weapons. And yeah, anybody comes close to me and they're gonna get shot. Simple as that. I'm not gonna ask any questions. You come on my property, you're gonna be shot. So then you better figure out how you're gonna explain how you got shot because I'm not holding any punches at this point. I'm in the town I'm in is a coven. I'm being gang stalked. So you come near me, I'm shooting you. I also wear a holster, so when I leave my room, I have my weapon with me, and that is not to make any kind of accusations or any threats because I think it would be absolutely insane for me just to be sitting here like a sitting duck because it's bad enough what they're doing to the inside of their house that I draw the line on. You want to come on my property? We have a different conversation going at that point. So if you have not made any arrangements to protect yourself or your family, I am not telling you what to do, but I am heavily suggesting that you better figure out what your needs are going to be. Do you have lights that will run on batteries and stuff? Because the thing that people do is they'll flick your lights and then break in. So, do you have cameras that work off the internet? I have cameras set up that are not connected to the internet. So you flip my power and I'm still going to be able to photograph you. Do you have dash cams for your cars? Be be protecting yourself any way that you can. And I mean that in all sincerity. These people will stop at nothing to destroy the rest of us. And obviously, they don't like me. They're willing to give me lung cancer and all this other stuff. So, yes, I decided a few years ago that I needed to take care of what's going on around here, and the only way to do it was to make sure that I was completely prepared. And I'm a very good shot. So, um, if you would have asked me this same question just a few years ago, I would have said, no way. What kind of lunatic would take that kind of a chance? Well, here we are. So let me wrap this up with a recap about this Moroccan mafia, which is running wild. And here it is. The Moroccan mafia has appeared in most of the large Belgian and Dutch cities, including Antwerp, Brussels, and Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Utrecht, and Almere. In the mid 2010s, criminal organizations were also established in southern Spain, mainly around the Costa Rica region, but also along the rest of Europe, South America, and more recently in the United Arab Emirates. According to a Dutch investigator, the Morocco mafia gains a revenue of around 20 billion euros a year. So the Morocco mafia, see, all of these groups are really collections of criminal groups, okay? And this group is primarily made up of Moroccan descent. So they are organizations specialized in trafficking large quantities of cocaine and synthetic drugs through Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, and Belgium, from where it is distributed to the rest of the European continent. So, a pretty big key point there with these Moroccan people, right? This all started, I talked about this in the past, these Moroccan deals. What they had originally was they had what they called the hashish route. And in broader terms of Moroccan organized crime, this also includes the hash kingpins because the Moroccan traffickers who play a key role in the African drug trade as well as in human trafficking, listen to that part, okay, arms trafficking, and the trafficking of contraband, such as cigarettes and alcohol, although they are seen as a separate entity from the Mocro Mafia, they're mostly active in the northern part of Morocco and Europe. So, hold on a second here. So, really, if you just focus on a few names here, you got the Mocro Mafia, they're running all the drugs into Europe. And it's also looping up around through Spain and Portugal. So, I'm getting too far into the weeds here. So, the name Mocro Mafia is given by the Dutch-speaking authorities in the Netherlands and Belgium, who refer to Moroccan crime organizations operating there. So I've already talked enough about this. Let's see here. Yeah, this actually originated originally in the 1980s. There were a couple of districts in Amsterdam, and there were a bunch of Moroccan immigrants, and some people started moving out, but not that important. So I think I've talked about these transits. There's a lot to all this traffic places, transit places. This all started, I did a show about you'll have to look for it about the Belgium, the trade in Amsterdam and all that. I'll see if I can find it. But officially all of the drugs, all of the trafficking, and what you'll find when you look at these mafia people, you don't find them talking about the child trafficking part. They pretty much seem to be leaving that part out. I must have watched 100 mafia shows in the last few weeks, and none of them were talking about trafficking children. None of them were talking about any of these rituals and that kind of stuff. But that is, in fact, what they're doing. So, what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to be coming back. I have one more segment I need to get done here, and it's about how exactly did the mafia get started. And that's an interesting story because one day I was sitting around doing all this mafia looking, and I just had this thought. I thought, I wonder if the Illuminati started the mafia. Well, I'll be darned, they sure did. So I just went over to Yandex and I asked the question, did the Illuminati start the mafia? And there we go. It all showed up. See, it's fun sitting around asking questions. And I thought, what an obvious question. But yeah, I asked it and I got this whole pile of information. The next segment is just going to be a couple minutes, but I need to catch my breath here, so I'll go ahead and put this on hold. And then when I return, we'll talk about how this all got started with the Illuminati. So be back in a sec. Okay, this will be, in fact, the final segment. So let's talk about organized crime. Organized crime, as a term, signifies a structured group of three or more people that exists for a prolonged period and acts concertedly with the aim of committing various serious crimes in order to obtain directly or indirectly a financial or other material benefit. Organized crime encompasses various forms such as drug trafficking, human trafficking, cybercrime, and arms trafficking. So let's talk about this person, Mazzini, Mazzini. In 1827, Mazzini joined a secret organization called the Carbonari, which was working for Italian independence. The organization was found out, and Mazzini spent 6 months in jail. After this, he moved to Marseille, France, where he lived in exile. It was from here that Mazzini wrote a stream of articles arguing for a republic of Italian states. He also formed a new political society known as Le Genovese Italia, which meant Young Italy. He also envisioned a secret dream of someday seeing a united Europe, with all European nations joining in a United States of Europe, much as had happened in North America. The Young Italy organization took an almost impossible goal of empowering the monarchy and the Pope. To do this, the group not only went into the shadows, but it began supporting itself by robbing banks, forcing places to pay ransom money, and even resorting to kidnapping. Thus evolved the Costa Nostra, better known as the Mafia. The name was an acronym for Mazzini, Autorizi, Futri, Inciti, Attini. Translated into English, Mazzini authorizes theft, arson, and kidnapping. So that's where the name Mafia came from. Mazzini also rose to the level of a 33-degree Mason and became the founder of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry in Italy. Thus, many believe there was an Illuminati branch of Freemasonry established. In addition to this, there appears to be a link between Mazzini and the creation of the Luciferian movement, which was basically a secret rebellion against the Roman Catholic Church. Books have been written by researchers who have attempted to link the complex life of Mazzini with the founding of the Italian Freemasons, the Mafia, and the Luciferians. One writer suggested the Scottish Rite had 33 degrees. Most individuals only advance through the first 3 levels and are ignorant of the true goals of the Scottish Rite and the Luciferians that govern at the top. It was at this point in Mazzini's life that General Pike became involved with him. That amazing part of this story is yet to come. So, organized crime of the mafia type only existed since the centuries, but only with the law of 1982 was the crime of mafia association introduced. So only in 1982. This has been boiling out of control forever, right? Since the second half of the 1950s, the mafiosos, either directly or through their accomplices, became legitimate entrepreneurs, especially in construction, but only with the law of 1982 can these mafia enterprises be touched. Since the 1970s, the financial size of these mafia groups, both in terms of their capabilities of accumulating capital and utilization of the financial system for money laundering, is significant, but only with recent measures can they begin to be fought. The responsive measures are almost always taken after the mafia has committed a terrible crime, murder of an important person, massacres through laws by decree. That is the due legal response. And this is how it all works, right? That's why they have all those lawyers. They button things up. So, Spanish kings ruled Naples and Sicily. See, this is where they all try to connect because I was looking more on the geography, okay? So, Spanish kings ruled Naples and Sicily from 1504 to 1707. And listen to this, from 1738 to 1860. So, Spain was in there up until 1860. Now, isn't that convenient? In the first Spanish reign, a criminal society was founded in Naples called the Camorra, a Spanish word meaning fight or quarrel. So that's where the Camorra comes from. So the infant Camorra was a direct offshoot of the Guaduna and very probably was composed of Spanish Guardias and native Napoleonites. During the second Spanish reign, the Camorra gave birth to a new society, the Sicilian Mafia. The connection link between the Camorra and the Mafia seems to have been the Italian Revolution hero Guiseppe Mazzini. The Cabari limped along until 1848, where no more record of their exploits were recorded. It is thought that many of the surviving Carbonari turned their organization into the Mafia. The design of the Carbonari and Mafia are very similar. Humility, respect for the rules and hierarchy, and when you are part of them, you are family, like cousins. So, yeah, I mean, that particularly ties them, right? So let's take a look at some of these people. I'm not going to do a complete genealogy on all these people, but now that we know more about what's going on over there in Ukraine, right, or Khazaria, I already told you who these people had parents, right? We also have those Kennedys, right? Because for a long time, I really thought that their backstories were fake. But no, these people really did come from nothing. They were brought over here to rule this place. Joe Kennedy, the patriarch of the Kennedy political family, was born Joseph Patrick Kennedy, September 1888 in Boston, Massachusetts. But here's where his parents were, okay? His parent was Patrick Joseph P.J. Kennedy. His father was a prominent Boston businessman and politician. He was born in East Boston, Massachusetts, but his parents, okay, his parents, Patrick Kennedy and Bridget Murphy, were Irish immigrants from County Wexford, Ireland. So all of their parents seem to have come over. And I also checked if the Kennedys did not come over on the Mayflower because they were Irish. Yeah, they came. I think there was a group that came over on the Mayflower, and that would be people like the FDR's family came over on the Mayflower. FDR's family was also responsible for the making China go lights out with all that opium and stuff. That's where FDR got his money from. And FDR's family originated out of the Netherlands. So yeah, they all are circling all around these little things. So yeah, some of them, like FDR's family, came over early. And then later on, late 1800, early 1900, they sent for the mafias. What happened? Exactly what happened, as far as I can tell. Now, obviously, we're all going to have different opinions, but that is the benefit of sharing my work and everybody talking about it. So, yeah, so here again, the Kennedys right before, let me see. So the first Kennedy in the family to arrive in America were Patrick Kennedy and Bridget Murphy. So they left Ireland during the Irish potato famine, 1848 to Boston. So there you go. They're coming right over there, right? The Roosevelt family, they also supposedly did not come over on the Mayflower. Instead, they were of Dutch descent and arrived in New Amsterdam in the 1600s. So, yeah, they could have been coming from different directions. Um, so, yeah, so the Roosevelts came in from the Dutch area, but you start to see the patterns here, right? They all seem to be kind of, a lot of them are seeming to be born in, they seem to be born in Germany. Anyway, so I think this about wraps it up. Uh, I'm going to be, I'm sure I'll have, this is a pretty big unloading of data, and I don't know, I'll be, reviewing it all later myself, and it seems like the right track to me because it ties in all the loose ends, right? It explains this deal with Ukraine. Why are they so loyal to Ukraine? Um, and here again, I just started off with one picture of one of those Pritzker's relatives and got into this whole mafia thing, right? So just keep asking questions. One question leads to another. I have more to talk to you about as far as my experience when my family was in Spain. Yeah. Anyway, so I'll have to deal with that later. I need to close this file off for right now. So, I don't think I have anything more to say. If I do, I'll certainly talk about it next. I'll be back with the Gary Webb story. I'm just way too exhausted to get into it now. The story deserves the time, and there's a lot of controversy in Gary Webb's story. A lot of people think that they killed him. I'm pretty sure I would have said they killed him a few years ago, but my opinion has changed. I'm pretty sure that that wasn't how it happened, but I want to have the amount of time to properly explain why I'm thinking that way. And that whole Iran-Contra thing, it's all been verified, and it is such a horrific thing that happened to the Black community that I want to give it its proper space and time. And today's not the time because the impact, the impact of that whole crack campaign thing still lives on to today. These people are racist of the worst kind. They're hiding their own black backgrounds, right? What's going on now is the Christian white people are aligning. All these churches have all become Zionists. Everybody is aligning with all this white Christian thing. And I guess that's why they cooked up these white people, because now white people look more powerful and all that kind of stuff. So be safe out there, and goodbye for now.